in 1996, there was a very hush-hush or not very much publicized NASA experiment that took place called AIRSAR, and this stood for simply Airborne Synthetic Aperture Radar. And it was this big DC-8 aircraft that they attached various radar imaging pieces of equipment to this DC-8 and would fly it over various areas to collect ground-penetrating radar. And one of the first places that they flew this over was in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And then when they flipped on the radar into interferometric mode, they were able to find that just off to the top right corner of the Angkor Wat pyramid was a small unknown mound that had never been discovered. The only reason why they found it was when they flipped on this ground-penetrating radar that could actually see depth perception via color imaging to see, wow, there's actually some other large object here that was being hidden by the canopy of the forest. So they deployed archaeologists and proper, excavation equipment to survey that area. Now, the reason why this is interesting is I have a friend who works with the AIRSAR, who is a mission director over at Dryden Research Facility at NASA, and he recently explained to me that they've been doing this synthetic aperture radar over Central America and have just recently found some hidden pyramids there. And it's a very interesting project that maybe many people don't realize that NASA actually does lend their technology and advances towards archaeological excavations.
So I first went to see Zecharia in Sedona at a seminar, signed up to go on a bunch of trips with him. And in the process of going on several trips with him, exploring all over the world and all over the ancient sites that he wrote about in all his books. And then you read an author like Zecharia that shows you how the Bible borrowed a lot of the stories, or if not most of them, and in some cases copied down the words, word for word, plagiarized in a way. And in some cases they just changed the stories or changed the names or left out very important details. So I was astonished to find so much more material in these ancient tablets that were not included in the Bible. So the story may be one paragraph in the Bible, but in the ancient tablets it's 10 or 12 tablets.
Erich, as he explained there, he comes from a Hebrew upbringing, whereas I was raised as a Christian. And tonight with the Sumerians, that would be kind of the pinnacle for ancient technology of a civilization that we're still trying to wrap our head around. But there are various cultures around the same time of the Sumerian epic on other continents that have just as much technology that really don't get as much attention but deserve definitely to be in the limelight.
When people look at the ancient tablets, and we're talking about tablets that were chiseled or carved in clay or in stone, thousands of years ago, mostly between 2000 and 4000 BC, they tell a very complete and a very detailed story. And these stories can be interpreted as stories of fictitious gods or fantasy, or they can be interpreted as real history. Part of what Jason and I both do is when we're looking at either evidence of ancient technology or artifacts, we want to corroborate something that the text describes, that the story describes. Let's say it says the god flew around in a divine boat, or a shield of fire, something like this. So when Zecharia started to look at all these ancient tablets, and he found not just the textual stories, but the visual record in depictions or carvings or even little artifacts that you can hold with your hand, he found that there was advanced knowledge in there. So the story that was told must have been more reality than fantasy. And who are we to say that they were not recording their history accurately?
Did he ever express to you, Erich, how astounded he was to uncover some of this and interpret it the way he has?
He has. He once found a little rocket ship in a museum in the drawer of the museum curator. And he heard about the piece, and the piece, because this museum never had seen anything like that, and of course rocket ships could not have existed thousands of years ago, they thought that it was a fake that was dug up 15 feet, under the ground.
Yeah.
So Zecharia was convincing enough to tell the curator that there's other artifacts like this around the world, and that's how he convinced him to display it, although they probably display it more like as a oddity and not necessarily as an official rocket ship from thousands of years ago. But Zecharia was able to show this curator that there were pieces in Central and South America which matched in the motif, in the style, and the design, what they found in Turkey. In this case, the little rocket ship was in Turkey. This is a worldwide study. You have to go everywhere to connect the dots. If we're talking about a true story of a civilization in the ancient past that was able to fly around, then they were a global civilization. They weren't just stuck in Sumeria or Mesopotamia. They were absolutely all over.
When you look at the text, when they talk about the collision with planet Earth of another body, astronomers are saying now that the moon was carved out of the planet after a collision with another major body. I mean, it's uncanny that a civilization of thousands and thousands of years ago would even have anything that would be remotely close to what astronomers are reporting on now.
That's true, but remember, they did not create those theories themselves. They simply wrote down what they were told by those Anunnaki who were their gods, and Anunnaki just means those who from heaven to earth came.
Who may have been astronomical witnesses to these events.
That's possible, but some of these things, like the formation of our solar system, goes back billions of years.
Right.
So they may not have witnessed it, but they may have had a keen idea from their viewpoint of what happened. And, the theory used to be that the moon came from actually a piece of Earth. Now, like you said, it's from this other body. But what is this other body?
And where did it go?
Exactly. Well, Zecharia has said that based on the Enuma Elish, the epic of creation in the Sumerian story, it describes what happened to that body. And that body it was caught by our sun's gravity and is continually repeating, going around our sun with an average orbit of 3,600 years, not a definite orbit every time, but an average.
Do you think this other planet is still inhabited?
Well, there is several possibilities. First of all, this planet would be very cold above ground. If they existed at all and survived, they would have to live below ground, near natural heat sources, and they would have to be very good at trapping their energy into their atmosphere. And that's kind of the theory of why Zechariah thinks they came, which was to mine gold, use it as a dust form in their atmosphere, and spread it to retain heat.
And Jason, you have done some work about ancients and their knowledge of flight.
Archaeologists today, when they find artifacts like an ancient rocket ship or some type of artifact in a Sumerian culture that shows the distance between the planets or is showing an Anunnaki with wings, they threw all of this into what they would call a myth pile, or just basically disregarded as saying this is mythology, information coming from a culture that is their mythology. If it's some little guy in a cloud or in a craft in the sky, since they obviously didn't have that technology, what they assume is that this is their myth. As a great example, though, we can see even in modern times how ancient people would have viewed technology, where right after World War II, when the U.S. flew to remote parts of like southern Africa and found tribes that had never been exposed to the white man or to technology, white man flies out over, in a biplane, lands, gets out of the plane and has voice recorders and lighters. To the tribes in Africa, these are gods. They didn't understand. So the white man leaves, and they make straw models of the biplane.
Right.
And they start worshiping this model plane, scraping away the runways, and hoping that this what they perceive to be gods would come back. But it turns out all over in various cultures, they've left us this type of information, and it really has gotten very specific with special artifacts and explanations for what they were seeing at that time. I mean, if you're an ancient person living in a clay hut and using stone tools, you're not going to be able to understand or explain to someone an anti-gravity aircraft or a space shuttle or even a biplane for that matter. In Egypt, for instance, there was in a tomb in Zecharia, they found what was at the time dated to be a wooden bird model, and they stored it in the basement of the Cairo Museum. It was then rediscovered by a Dr. Messiah who studied models by ancients and said, well, look, to me, this looks just like a modern-day airplane. And various other artifacts, from other cultures, like in South America, we have other airplane models that literally look just like a biplane. Now, on display, they're considered to be insect models. Yet anyone that would look at this from the standpoint of what we're showing, various samples from other cultures, a combined realization of some type of knowledge for the power of flight.
What if these weren't extraterrestrial visitations, but that we had advanced civilizations on this planet, Earthlings, who somehow blew themselves up?
You bring up a good point, George, that has kind of fascinated my curiosity over the last couple of years. I haven't really been able to pinpoint it as thoroughly as I have towards the Sumerian culture for saying, here's the evidence. But I definitely do see a pattern of what you're hinting at, and here's what I would say. All around the world, for instance, like the pyramids at Giza or the huge megalithic stones at Baalbek, or even in South America, like Pumapunku, we have these huge megalithic stones that have been quarried from miles away and stacked perfectly or positioned in astroarchaeological sites, positioned towards the stars and stuff, where the immensity of some of these spots, some of these stones, literally can't be explained, and it doesn't make sense to rest them on the shoulders as cultures such as the Egyptians or the Mayans or the Toltecs for explaining some of these sites. And the reason why I say that is when we look at the stories for an Atlantean culture and the evidence to show in other texts, like recorded by Plato and such, that there was some type of advanced culture that did exist, that if this is true, if there was some type of an Atlantean culture, they obviously would have spread out to the other continents, and these megalithic monuments are a great sign that might have just been the case.
What is your take on that possible theory, Erich?
Well, it's reasonable to think that there have been several civilizations and epochs that have risen and fallen through the thousands or millions of years. Unfortunately, though, the textual evidence, the actual stories, don't fit that hypothesis, because the texts do describe specifically travels from where they came from their planet to ours.
That's true.
It did explain that when they got here, they established a redo of the first city, home in the far away, and they made canals and they built irrigation ditches and harvesting and cultivation. Now, that was done a second time after the Great Flood that we've all known about. They had to rebuild. But the first time, they describe all the detailed work of what they did. And then the text describes several 100,000 years of these ancient characters or gods working and then eventually getting upset with their conditions and revolting, necessitating the need to create a workforce. And the workforce happens to be us nowadays. So the stories do not match the theory that it's always been humans. After all these years of research into this kind of material, I realize that Earth has been always visited. We've never just been alone without anything going on. For some reason, it seems to be that this planet is interesting. Now, I'm one of those people that believes the universe is infinite. So I believe in infinite galaxies and infinite potential civilizations. I don't think by any means, there's a small number around in the universe. There's nothing rare about us.
Several times I've tried to give the coordinates that Zecharia pointed out in the 12th planet of where this planet Nibiru may be, but they can't seem to find it.
Well, one factor is that it comes in from the southern hemisphere. And it tends to be that most observatories or telescopes are actually in the northern hemisphere. Another thing is there are verified sightings in some of the ancient tablets in about 555 BC, where the story that Zecharia tells is that they witnessed this planet being in a certain constellation. So based on an observation of 555 BC or so, Zecharia sort of predicted where it was going to go and where it was. But I think the accuracy got better after the 12th planet was written.
Another area of our archaeological significance is, the tomb of Pakal, and him being, seated what it clearly looks like an astronaut seated in a space capsule, blasting off. They say he's descending into the underworld, or, there's a lot of interpretation of what modern archaeologists would leave out any piece of evidence pointing towards the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
He's obviously sitting in some kind of machine. It could be a time machine. Who knows?
But you know what, George? There's more details in that depiction than most people discuss. You'll notice that his nose is hooked up to a breathing apparatus. And if he's dead, why does he need to be breathing? His head is being supported really properly if you were going to take off on your back. His hands are working levers or something. And I've even seen Von Daniken show in a presentation exhaust and rocket fumes coming from the bottom of that guy's little chamber that he's in.
What if they just put him to sleep while he travels in space?
Hibernation?
Yes.
It's a great theory. But they were depicting Pakal, how he lived. In other words, it's interesting. If ancients are going to go through all the work, and this, by the way, this coffin lid is over 6 feet long. It's a lot of work. And they went through so much effort to make specific detail and depict it as close to accuracy as they could. why would then somebody say, well, it's just made up? Maybe they just observed what they observed. It's not for us to change the thinking or the intent of the artist or the art workers. We simply have to see what they left and say, is this possible in our realm of understanding? And actually it is.
Throughout history, we have had so-called teachers from the sky. Will these teachers ever come back?
I sure hope so. You know, an interesting correlation with, you know, where I've put my focus on with the Sumerian culture and their gods, which they called the Anunnaki. And we have, you know, various wall descriptions and carvings of how they depicted the Anunnaki. And an interesting similarity is that cultures that come out of South America, right around the same time frame, for instance, the Toltecs, you know, turning into the Mayan culture, this whole culture was renowned and revered for a god that they claimed had long, flowing white hair, was pale-skinned, and had dark blue eyes, known as Viracocha, and then in preceding cultures as Kukulkan. And why this is so amazing is that if you look at all the South American people, they're dark-skinned, yet their god was a long, white-haired, flowing, pale-skinned, blue-eyed figure.
Who obviously wasn't from their neck of the woods.
Exactly. And so the reason why, you know, it's really interesting is that this culture has amazing, they were almost, you know, obsessed with astronomy and accuracy of time, speaking of the Mayans. And this splinters out into various other cultures in South America, but specifically with the Mayans and their various sites like Chichen Itza, which I believe Erich has visited.
I have.
You know, we see the sites just being completely aligned with astronomical points. The pyramid of Kukulkan is actually a three-dimensional calendar. There's 91 steps. It's a four-sided ziggurat pyramid with 91 steps, and that equals 364 days in the year, with the top platform equaling 365. So it's actually a three-dimensional calendar. And this is the same type of, you know, accuracy in architecture that we see, for instance, in the Egyptian pyramids, where the type of accuracy and precision really can't be attributed to an ancient culture of 2500 BC unless they were using some type of advanced knowledge that had to have been passed to them. And that's exactly what they say, is this information was taught to us by Viracocha or Kukulkan.
Well, in the case of the Great Pyramid of Egypt, it's actually a model of the northern hemisphere of the Earth. It has a scale ratio that's one of those precessional numbers. And precession is one of those funny things that you have to be very advanced in mathematics and astronomy to figure out. And we do find evidence of precessional knowledge in these ancient tablets. And you see evidence of precessional knowledge in the construction of the Great Pyramid. But you would have had to see Earth from the air to know. You would have had to know the size of the globe.
Well, and that's where, like, Erich von Däniken comes in with his chariots of the gods theories.
Yeah, that's ancient astronauts theory. It's the same thing, I think.
Dogon tribe, by the way, is in West Africa. I said it was near New Guinea. It is not.
Mm-hmm. You know, speaking of Erich von Däniken, just a quick note that I would bring up. There was some very interesting findings in Peru that really, like, never get news headlines. Anytime we hear about Peru, it's kind of infamous with the Nazca lines in Peru, which are in and of themselves very interesting, because any tourist that goes to Nazca and flies over the lines there, you see the El Astronato. It's this huge, you know, glyph of a humanoid figure waving at you, and these are only meant to be seen from the sky. But an interesting part in this vicinity is that there's other, let's just say, artifacts that have been discovered, and these have really only been classified by Erich von Däniken, where there's these large geometric diagrams in the mountains just south of the Pisco Valley. And these diagrams, you can only see them from flying over with an airplane, but they're very, very large in scale. We're talking about over a mile in circumference, where when you first look at this from the sky, it's a large, like a square that has a circle drawn around it that's meeting each of the 4 points of the square, and around the circle there are little grid points on the outer perimeter like markers. And when you look at this just one circle, if you circle up higher in the plane, bringing more into perspective on the ground, you see that the geometric diagram enlarges to actually have 3 sets of circles with repeating 33-degree angles. And really no one has ever covered this or asked what these were for, But in that same area, there's a weird stretch of these band of holes as well that's found in the Pisco Valley. And these can actually be found by looking at the coordinates through Google Map and Google Earth to actually zoom in and see that these anomalies are there in the mountains.
Do you think these visitations by ancient astronauts are what drove religion on this planet, in that all religions are based on we were visited by extraterrestrials?
Well, yes and no. The oldest occurrence of an event is recorded. But after that original occurrence is recorded, each individual culture takes the stories and changes the names and creates a whole thing around it. So you have an ancient set of stories that is the predecessor of all the ancient Judeo-Christian religions and some other ones as well. But what each group does with it, that was their own destiny. So if the original event was a misidentification of an alien ancient astronaut sighting and something that happened, a close encounter, George, they wrote it the way it was. They didn't say that these were gods. The original mistranslation of their word for these rocket ships was mistranslated to the word God the next time that language changed. And that's part of my specific research, as I look back for the certain words and where those origins of words and other ideas come from.
Yeah.
And so if it starts with a misidentification and you keep running with it, everything's going to be inaccurate.
You agree with that, Jason?
I do, and I'm sure Erich would touch on this as well, is that, when we look at the Sumerian culture and the various stories coming out of that and translated by people like Samuel Kramer and, of course, Zechariah Sitchin, the explanations for the gods coming here and why they were here, in the first place, there's a lot of interpretation for the meaning behind that. And as an example, when we look at the depictions of the Anunnaki, we see wall reliefs that depict them as with a beak or having wings, just like we see in the Bible, angels being depicted with wings. But did they actually have wings? Is this something they were trying to symbolically tell us, or were they actually trying to depict something they saw? And as a reference, when we first sent, astronauts to the moon with Apollo 11, we say, Houston, the eagle has landed.
Right.
And we give, the Apollo 11 patch is an eagle landing on the moon. Of course, we weren't landing birds on the moon. We were just symbolically saying that they had the power of flight. And a lot of these stories that we have from the Sumerian culture speak of a time when man lived amongst his living gods. Just like in the Bible it says there were giants upon the earth. Mm-hmm. Sumerians speak of a time when they carried out practices and rituals that commanded by, let's say, a high priest and recorded by a scribe would be taken over and over again as things to follow. But when the gods leave and the priests are left to follow these rituals, who do they turn to for guidance?
The Anunnaki that Zecharia talks about, do you believe that they were evil?
No, their intentions to them were very positive and moral and noble. How it feels to us later, it could feel maybe not evil, but certainly harmful in many ways. But they didn't expect what they got. When the stories describe how when they first created the human race, there wasn't a lot of them. But then they really propagated very easily, and they were very noisy, and they complained a lot, and they kept the god Enlil awake at night. The Enki and Enlil were the two sons of Anu. Enlil really was more negative towards humanity, and Enki loved humanity. Enki is the character that in the Bible tells his human Noah to build an ark and save his family. In the Sumerian story, that's Enki. And Enlil's the one who tells all the other gods to be quiet about the impending disaster so that they don't warn the majority of the human population.
Yeah, they want to wipe them out.
Well, that was his decree, and he was the boss. But Enki violated the decree, and he called his favorite human, whose name was Ziusudra. And then in a later text, it became Atrahasis and Utnapishtim. All of these names are the same character, the Noah from the Bible, who survives the flood.
There is a tablet actually stored in the British Museum that's called the Flood Tablet. This is a tale that, as it's told, is that, British archaeologists doing excavations in Iraq, one of the assistants to the curator, a gentleman named George Smith, uncovers this Assyrian version of the Old Testament, which is basically a derivative of cuneiform script, and it's explaining the same version word for word, in this, much earlier version. And he, this curator, George Smith, and this is in like 1872, he, throws his hands up in amazement and freaks out because here we have first-hand knowledge that a biblical tale is being found in an actual stone version, which is thought to be possibly in its original form.
George, the interesting thing about the Noah's Ark story is that the Bible actually copies word for word a certain statement that's in the Mesopotamian version. That is that after they come out of the ark and they build them a sacrifice and they cook, God comes down and the Bible says that God smelled the pleasing aroma. That's a direct copy from the Sumerian tablets, which says the gods smelled the fragrance, the gods smelled the pleasing fragrance.
Charred flesh, yeah.
The creator God of the Bible should not be interested in meat being cooked and smells. But that characteristic of that previous God from the previous culture's story stayed in there. And many things like that occur where certain forms of the stories, they had to keep a certain statement or a certain way of saying it. And those old references are how we know that it was actually the same story that was in the Mesopotamian version is the one that the Bible uses, but they left out a few details.
Why did they leave the planet?
Zechariah talks about a couple things. First of all, there's tablets that describe how when the grandparents came down to view the grandchildren and visit them, the grandchildren were older than the grandparents. Because according to Einstein's theory of relativity, the farther away you are from a gravitational source, the slower time will feel for you. For these guys who were on a planet with a very long orbit, they didn't age as fast as we do, zipping around the sun every 365 days. Mm-hmm. When they came here after several thousands of years, they started to become subjected to our time frame. And so the grandchildren started to become older than the grandparents. So some of them left because they would have died. Some of them actually chose to die here. And we're trying to get to the British Museum to see some remains of a princess that was found in the royal tomb of Ur. Her headdress is in Philadelphia in the University Museum, and the headdress is really big. It's a really big head. But the remains in the British Museum, we have to go through the formal procedure of requesting it and justifying why we want to look at this very old set of bones.
You mean abnormally big?
Well, we don't know for sure. We don't have any specific measurements. All we have is the headdress. By the way, in that same tomb, they found a little model of a ram with its horns caught in branches, which is part of a story that turns out with Abraham before he attempts to sacrifice Isaac.
Also, in coming here, there are seals that actually explain and depict, for instance, the creation of the Adam. Mm-hmm. Not Adam and Eve as in the story in the biblical tale, right, but a sense of an actual creation of a worker.
Genetically manipulated.
Correct. And what's really interesting on the scientific side of this is that even Time magazine did an issue in saying that roughly 300,000 years ago is when the mitochondrial DNA shows up for us in southern Africa. And we're talking 300,000 years ago. That's the genetic sequence that matches the Homo sapien that we are today. That mitochondrial DNA is passed inherently by the mother only. And so it can show a genetic track record. And it turns out that the information bequeathed by the Anunnaki is in the same time frame of when they originally came here to Earth and found out that there was this large deposit of gold in southern Africa, which they decided to start mining. And in doing so, in this process of mining, they found out that it was a great toil. They didn't like mining the gold themselves, and this is why they decided to create a worker, a primitive worker. The first version, I believe, is called a Luluamelu. Mm-hmm. And this is just a very interesting tale that comes into play where we get the whole explanation for, one, why the Anunnaki originally came to Earth, which is because they said they destroyed or were destroying their planet's atmosphere, Nibiru. Their planet Nibiru is where the Anunnaki came from. So they came here seeking gold to repair their atmosphere. But the interesting part of that is, yes, throughout time, man has revered gold. You see gold, you hold it, it's something very precious to us. Why? So over time, all of this information starts to be put into a context for why the Anunnaki originally came here, why they created us, and their whole view on what our purpose was to them.
Do you believe that this civilization, the Anunnaki, may have had the most profound effect on our planet?
I do personally, yes. I mean, since we can't really see any other culture like we were discussing earlier for an Atlantean, some type of advanced technology or culture that's spread across the globe, there is no pinpoint for anything more advanced that I can put my hands on as a reference than to say that the Anunnaki were actually living beings here that existed. Another thing I'd point out, too, is just like those descriptions of Viracocha and Kukulkan, you know, fair skin, long flowing white hair, blue eyes. When we look at some of the descriptions of the Anunnaki, there could be some correlation, especially with the time frame for the exact same era of 3000 BC of when the Mayans started and when the Sumerian culture came about. There's this cross parallel for all the advanced technologies in agriculture and astronomy that come out of both of these cultures around that same time.
What about the interpretation, Erich? What if Zechariah's interpretation is different?
Most often when I hear from people how they feel, Zechariah's material really opens up something for them and makes them want to do more research into their own culture, which is how my search started to find out where I'm from, which is the question of really where we all are from. What makes the Sumerian evidence so compelling is that there's almost 1 million tablets that they have found. And they're all the same as the original scribe wrote them because they're in clay or stone. It's not like on parchment where you can have a miscopy. This is the original we're looking at. And also in the ancient empires, every time they conquered an empire, from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian, Assyrian, they would copy all of their ancient texts. So we have versions of all these texts in different cultures and different languages and slightly different names in this. The evidence is overwhelming that these stories and this information is the predecessors to our own, to our religious views, and even more. When you go to the baker or you go to buy donuts, how many do you buy?
So I'd buy a dozen.
Okay, did you ever wonder why it's a dozen when we all have 10 fingers and 10 toes?
No.
Most people don't even think about it. That's the kind of questions that I had. Why is it a dozen? Why is there 12 calendar months? Why is there 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples of Jesus, 12 Olympian gods? Why is this recurring 12 coming all the time? And the answer actually is pretty simple. The Sumerian mathematical system is called sexagesimal, which was anything was divisible by 6, and then they multiplied 6 by 10. So anything was divisible was always even numbers and very easy for them to calculate gigantic numbers. The ones that came out with the 360-degree circle, which is 6 times 60, and the 24 hours in a day in the olden days that used to be called 12 double hours. Again, 12 came up. The reason the number 12 is because this Anunnaki religion or their way of viewing the world and viewing their place in the solar system, they assigned an astronomical object to 12 different gods. And they used the sun and the moon and the 9 planets we have that we know about, and they used that extra planet Nibiru. And they assigned one of the 12 to each god. So they had a base that came out with 12, which was obviously 2 times 6. So this numbering system, which affects our time and our way of counting and our calendar to this day, was created by them.
And I'd also continue that sentence with another 12, the 12 houses of the zodiac. Mm-hmm. So they were the first ones to divide the heavens into 12 parts and assign for that location, a certain constellation. And people ask, well, how would you know, and what was the point of knowing about which cycle you were in? You could basically come out at sunrise and see what constellation the star is rising in front of and say, we are in the age of Pisces or in the age of Aquarius. And there's actually another little tie-in to this is that there's been a device, a Greek calculator, which they called the Antikythera mechanism. It's been kind of mystified by scholars for a while because, they did radar on this and found that it's got 37 or so cogs and wheels, all intricately tied together, more complicated than a Swiss watch. But it's thought to have been a very interesting piece of technology used for mainly 2 purposes. One, for astronomical sightings, where if you're a seaman, you could, plot with this device the positions of stars and, set a course. But it also had astrological data where it was very esoteric for someone at that time to have a device that could tell you, tonight Mars is going to be aligned with Venus, or your planet sign is going to be in this location, and it would be good for you to do this at that time. So it was very esoteric knowledge for someone to be able to possess the ability to say where the positions of the planets are in relation to each other, and that's basically what the Antikythera mechanism did. It had.
How old is this mechanism?
Well, it's believed to be around 1,500 to 2,000 years old, but there's no set date on it exactly. There's also discrepancies as to who could have built it in the Greek time frame. One of the people it's postulated is maybe Archimedes, who's a very advanced mathematician and technologist. So just a lot of the things, again, when we talk about the Sumerians and their legacy of information, that number 12, as Erich pointed out, is really a great pinnacle of looking at some of the facts for everything that we use today, from our time to calendar to the count, 12 in a dozen, 12 inches in a foot, but also 12 planets in our solar system. And that's where the Anunnaki say that they originally came from,
Right.
is from the 12th planet.
Well, yeah, it's like 12 objects.
12 objects, yeah.
But see,
celestial objects.
In the ancient word, the astrological object, they sometimes use the same term. So it could be translated as planet.
I believe there's an actual tablet that shows the route actually taken by the Anunnaki from their vicinity of the solar system, from Nibiru to actually here.
That piece is called the planisphere, and it's in the British Museum. It's on their permanent display. It's a round disc carved object.
How many past civilizations talked about extraterrestrial visitations?
Which ones didn't? How about that? Did any civilization not have gods?
I don't think so. I think they all had gods of some
And that's the problem.
form or fashion.
Because obviously we, in a society of belief in a single creator God, you can't accept that there's multiple other gods. So were the stories true, mythology, or misidentified?
When the Anunnaki eventually left, for reasons, amongst themselves, different clans having their own rivalries.
They fought, didn't they?
They fought. There was a whole ritual process of, while they were here, there was, a very sacred ritual that would take place in that, they would record information from high priests, written down by scribes, and then bequeathed to the people in certain areas of what information was allowed to be told. But this process of taking sacred information from the Anunnaki and having it transcribed into stone was something that became a process that they were used to. And once the Anunnaki left, they have no more process of who do the priests, high priests, turn to now to get their moral information and write down, these sacred texts.
Sure.
So that's when it really starts to go in these directions of my God, your God, because of the various different Anunnaki clans and sects that started making these rivalries happen. There are a couple anomalies as far as some ancient maps, the Phineas map, and I believe the other one is the Peri-Reis map, that were being passed around in like 1531, and shows the accurate topography of Antarctica and South America, North America, and there's no way that anyone would have. And I should also say that in 1531, this is done on like a sheepskin or a lambskin. There's writing on the side of the map that says that these were recorded from much older sources. So when we start to go back in time, there's really no one that I can put my hands on evidence-wise other than what the Sumerians have prognosticated, as the Anunnaki's knowledge, for who could have given them the type of knowledge to say, well, here's what the topography looks like of your landmass, some large chunk of ice that could drop into the ocean. There are accurate land masses depicted in this Phineas map and the Peri-Reis map that actually show the topography accurately underneath the ice shelves for Antarctica. So there's no way that anyone without ground-penetrating radar, also done from the sky, would be able to have this type of knowledge. Yet we have clear evidence that shows these maps were made from much earlier sources, cited even us the way back to Mesopotamia. So if the Anunnaki actually did come here, as the Sumerians say, and Nibiru having effects on us in the past, just like the flood tablet explaining, I believe actually in the creation epic, you can change me if I'm wrong here, Erich, but we have stories that explain that this is actually why the flood took place. It was that the passage of Nibiru actually caused these great catastrophes. And there's actually Sumerian cylinder seals that show, for instance, a man plowing the dirt and looking up in awe where you can see the sun and a glowing cross symbolizing Nibiru in the sky as it was approaching.
They definitely attributed those disasters around the time of the planet Nibiru. So at least to them, there was a connection. Now, we don't know what the real physics was, but more than likely it had something to do with it.
Yeah, there of course has been a lot of speculation in the last few years, which George and everyone here is familiar with, for when Nibiru or Planet X might return. And as we touched on earlier, the work of Dr. Harrington was really a pivotal point in the Planet X research on the modern front, where there really was no talk or speak of a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth out there beyond Pluto until Dr. Harrington came on the scene and collaborated with Zechariah Sitchin. And Dr. Harrington is saying, yes, I confirm that my Planet X model, a 10th planet beyond Pluto, would come around in the same type of apogee. And what's really interesting is that Dr. Harrington's research really was one of the first to show that based on the outer planets, there's a perturbation, some type of pull being exerted by the outer planets in a certain direction, which led them to think there must be some other large body out there. Now, they don't look for extrasolar planets using that mind frame anymore. It's using more advanced solar and radio waves being able to be generated in space to, look at high temperatures and cold temperatures and discern mass. But it's just very interesting research that we have, even to this day, discussions for a planet that would be something that size, 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. And if that is ever discovered, then yes, it's possible that we might have ancestors on that planet.
Well, why is it, though, that whenever I ask an astronomer about Nibiru, the possibilities, they all seem to poo it away? They don't agree with it.
One reason is because they think the conditions have to be absolutely perfect for life to thrive. But there is a possibility, like life on Earth, according to these stories, life had help to thrive and survive. The Anunnaki themselves may have had help.
If the Anunnaki genetically created us in their image and after their likeness, well, the Anunnaki just have to be gods with the small g. Someone had to have created the Anunnaki.
And so then a scientist would have trouble because now you're attributing it to something that he cannot test. The universe is now dated somewhere between 15 to 16 billion years old based on the position of certain quasars and the oldest part of space. Our solar system is somewhere between 4 and 5 billion years old. We are Johnny-come-lately in this universe. Imagine a civilization that is 500,000 years ahead of us. Now, the Anunnaki, they were on Earth around 450,000 years ago or so. They developed space travel probably just right before that. 500,000 years in the span of several billion means they only beat us by a snap of a finger. They just beat us before we were able to get into space on an evolutionary timescale that's very small.
Interestingly enough, when we look at the 12 planets in our solar system, everyone assumes that term, third rock from the sun, Earth is the third planet, when in fact the Anunnaki said that we were on the 7th planet, Ki, the sacred number 7, 7 days in a week, 7 tablets of creation, and counting from coming into our solar system, meaning if you were to pass by Pluto and count Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Earth is the 7th planet. So coming outward in, we're actually on the 7th planet, and that's what the Anunnaki prognosticated, was that Earth was the 7th planet. They actually showed signs for Mars being the 6th planet and communication of how they used Mars as a way station to transport gold when it was being mined, as a way station to transport it between Earth and Nibiru.
The evidence for what Jason is talking about is actually contained on the planisphere disk that we referenced before, held in the British Museum, where it actually tells the story of their god Enlil leading his people past the planets. And they have the dots, the 7 dots showing the planets that they passed by. And the planisphere has a lot of other astronomical type of navigation information on it.
Or alongside the other tablet, another Sumerian amazing artifact that shows, as a backdrop to the cylinder seal, a complete model of our solar system, which the most important point of this is that the sun is in the center. Till the time of Copernicus and Galileo, we thought Earth, was the center of the universe, where here, in fact, on a 4,500-year-old tablet, thank you, we have a depiction of an accurate solar system that does include all the planets that we know of, with an additional planet, Nibiru.
You, Jason, of course, you've done some work on the pyramid at Chichen Itza and some other different areas of South America and Central America. What do you think was going on there?
Well, I think it's basically kind of what we were discussing with the Sumerian epic is they have the same stories and same artifacts, the same precision towards astronomical alignments in their architecture that really speak of a time when there was some type of technological understanding. When we look at the artifacts coming from Teotihuacan or Pumapuku, as I mentioned earlier, in Pumapuku there are these stone blocks that have laser. I mean, the only way to describe these is they have to be some type of laser drilled precision, and they didn't have any tool at that time that's known to make these types of holes. Some of these blocks in Pumapuku have 6 millimeter drilled holes that go all the way through the stone, and there's no way that science today can explain how they did it. Another piece of this is these stones were filled. They had like scoopings removed, and 2 blocks would be put together on a side, and then they would fill these scoop marks with a molten liquid that would then harden into a latch, keeping the 2 stones in place. And so a lot of this technology, metallurgy and that such, wasn't really attributed to cultures at that time, yet we have clear evidence that shows artifacts and architecture that utilize technology that we just still don't attribute to where they got it from. If we ask them, they bequeath to us saying, well, this was something taught to us by Kukulkan or Viracocha.
The ancients always attribute their knowledge and a lot of what they got to their gods. And they don't take credit for a lot of the things. Yet, in the Mesopotamian story, sometimes you do have the king or the emperor taking credit for a battle or building an aqueduct, but not for the basic knowledge that they handed down, that they always attributed to their gods.
The Sumerians were expert astronomers, weren't they?
That's correct. They had knowledge of precession that was even well beyond anything that we could comprehend for that period of time. There was a tablet, George, that had a unbelievable number on it, 12,960,000, and it divided it all the way down till there was nothing left by their sexagesimal system. So they basically divided everything that's in the precession, and they came up with the 25,920 years for the full yearly cycle of the precession. Well, obviously they didn't figure it out on their own. Somebody had to, give them the information and told them what to write down. And they attributed to it. Even the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal didn't take credit for this one.
We're getting still lots of reports of these alien grays that are coming down to the planet. Obviously, the Anunnaki, they were a different type. Why haven't they come back?
Well, one thing I'll throw out there is that there are many Sumerian figurines that have a very strong resemblance to the modern-day gray aliens.
True.
And there are texts, which I've heard Zechariah speak of in his lectures, of instructions a Sumerian would give to one of these beings to decipher whether it was living or not. And it's just a very interesting similarity of these Sumerian figurine statues having very bulbous, oversized heads, large eyes in some of them, with just a similarity to what the Greys look like.
They're actually described as a robotic-type being that they could program. It had medical knowledge, and it was sent like on an assignment. They didn't treated in the text like another Anunnaki normal. They were obviously, so if they could create us, then they may have created other type of beings or modified. That's more like what they seem that they are.
And it seems possible that if they could, create us in their image and after their likeness, why not create another overseer or watcher race, maybe a hybridization of them and the Greys, but,
sure.
Just to keep an eye on us and relay back to the Anunnaki what's going on. And I'm hypothesizing, but if we look at abduction scenarios, it's medical, reproductive analysis. What are they doing with that information? Maybe they're passing it on to their forefathers.
What's really interesting, is, George, is to look into the past and see the track record of data that we have, which kind of did start around the time of Zechariah Sitchin writing his book called The 12th Planet in 1976. And what we have is Zechariah Sitchin not only making connections to this ancient Sumerian culture. It was very specific in saying that their gods, the Anunnaki, came here and they visited us from another planet within our solar system they called Nibiru. Now, it sounds like a science fiction story, in a high-level description, but as we delve further into this topic, we see that the Sumerian culture has left us, and science and, modern academics confirm this, over 100 of the firsts needed for a modern civilization. And a big part of their knowledge was astronomy. So they tracked the movements of the heavens, the stars, certain constellations, over hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. So it's really a stacked up of evidence that, they have a lot of academic information around astronomical observations, and many other cultures. But where they cross the line is that they say, well, wait a minute, we are tracking one other planet as well. But this is a special planet because it's where the gods come from, the gods that we interact with, that we call Anunnaki, which simply means those who from heaven come to earth. So Zechariah Sitchin, looking into all these ancient texts, then started to branch out from this information and try and confirm this data. And in doing so, he first went to the Naval Observatory in Washington in the early 80s, and that was someone named Dr. Robert Harrington. And he was the lead astronomer at the time for the Naval Observatory. He had been plotting a planetary course to explain all the orbital anomalies in our solar system, why Uranus is tilted on its side. Could it be that Neptune and Pluto were dislodged moons of Saturn at one time? All the weird things that are going on in our solar system, he could explain by interjecting one large planet that swept through and caused all these perturbations, if you will, is the term that he used. And essentially that's the same model that Mike Brown is kind of looking at today with his assistant, is they're using math to determine that, wow, there is something that's pulling on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, George, this has been going on for a very long time. Even when we sent the first probes like Voyager 1 and Galileo, their orbits became retarded as if something was pulling at them. But we still have not been able to find what that source of the pull is. More than likely, George, we've already photographed Planet X, or even Nibiru, more specifically, probably many, many times. The problem is identifying it. We use these, telescopes and take large shots of the sky, and they store them as plates, is what they're called.
Right.
And so these digital plates have thousands of stars and all kinds of things on them that you have to analyze certain plates and do the mathematical analysis.
And if you see one star or something out of kilter, they figure there it is, right?
Exactly. So there's a lot of candidates on all of the data that they've been gathering over the years for a Planet X. But the problem is being able to distinguish what the orbit of some of these stars are. And this planet that they've been able to identify seems to have an orbit, which makes it a part of our own solar system. And who knows how many more planets are out there. The kicker of this story, and where we're going with this, is, if there is a Planet X, some ancient Planet X or a Nibiru that's talked about by the Sumerians, then we could possibly have actual ancestors that live on this planet.
What kind of a heat source do you think a planet that is out that far has, even if it might have inhabitants? How does it stay warm?
Nibiru, as described by the ancients, the Sumerian culture, they wrote down that it was a very luminous planet, bright red, and that one of these gods actually explained and sat down with a priest and gave a wealth of information as to why they even came here in the first place, which was to mine gold. And the reason why they needed gold was, in their own rise to a technological civilization, they damaged the atmosphere of Nibiru. And so they found that they could take fine particulates of gold and shoot it into the atmosphere and create a synthetic patch over these holes and keep the heat more insulated. So more than likely, Nibiru probably is emanating its own light somehow, like natural luminescence, and also has the ability to expel heat and trap it based on its atmosphere. Now, another variable that we haven't really considered up till now is the idea that we are a binary solar system, that we have two suns, not just one, but two. So a binary solar system would point to the idea that Nibiru, a Planet X, maybe not even just one planet, but several, are caught in a much larger orbit, not only around just our one sun that's active, but our second sun that has now become what we would call a brown dwarf or a dark star. How does Nibiru sustain its orbit going into the depths of space? Well, it's probably because it's orbiting a second sun. Now, the second sun angle of Nibiru is a huge part of this story, George, and actually might even tilt the topic away from a planet into looking for something else. What's really interesting about this, George, is that it's continuing the idea that everything the Sumerians put forth around the idea of a Planet X seems to still be holding its weight.
Jason, do you believe then this object that they think they have found could be indeed Nibiru?
Probably not. Nibiru, as described by the ancient Sumerian Epic of Creation, which Zechariah Sitchin translated, is around 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. And it would take it in an orbit, as you mentioned, around 3,600 years. And that number, 3,600, seems to be a very well-calculated number based on even breaking down 360 degrees and just adding another zero, right? It's a very symmetrical number that follows along the mathematical lineage of Sumerian culture. But it is an interesting candidate that does speak to, again, a whole slew of information that's come out over the last couple of decades. You know, there's been other theories too, George, right, that they slant on this. One came out recently called the Orpheus theory, and it explains that a large rogue planet enters our solar system in the past and smacks our primitive Earth, and in such a way that the debris coalesce to form our moon.
That's right.
So a gentleman named Dr. Richard Mueller out of Berkeley came up with a theory called the Nemesis theory. He calculated that there was another large planet that essentially got ejected from the Oort cloud, which is a huge asteroid belt well beyond Pluto. And his theory was that periodically this planet's orbit through the Oort cloud would eject other debris like comets and asteroids, and that was what was subjecting us at a much longer orbit over millions of years, you know, would cause it to impact Earth. And he theorized that's probably what caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, that there was some large rogue planet on its orbit periodically dislodging debris from the Oort cloud and sending it hurtling towards us. And in theory, too, there is some logic to that, because a lot of our planets, our moon, even us, we've just been bombarded, right, by comets and debris over the last, you know, who knows, millions of years.
Can't planetary scientists, though, Jason, take this 3,600-year orbit and pinpoint where this planet might be?
They can, but again, only relatively speaking. When we take a 3D plate of the sky, a lot of times they capture all types of different objects that are extrasolar planets or even rogue stars and such. But being able to calculate the orbit of all of these different objects is really like finding a needle in a haystack. One of the tablets that Zechariah Sitchin translates, it's a circular tablet, which that in itself was really odd, because they didn't even think at the time of the Sumerians that man had understanding of the wheel, which is sad. Anyways, here they have a circular tablet, and on this circular tablet, there's an actual description where it describes the path the Anunnaki take coming from outside our solar system, making course corrections around the outer planets, counting certain planets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until they reached the 7th planet, Earth. And on the side of this description on this tablet, there are little translated words that say things like rocket, pile up, mountain, high, high, high. So it's a very interesting text that seems to describe, let's call it a space chart or a course correction used by the Anunnaki in their navigational course towards Earth.
One of the things that has fascinated me, too, with all this work, Jason, has been the ancient depictions of rocket ships. We were either very highly technologically advanced, or we had a lot of visitors.
Well, a lot of these depictions that we have, at least from the Sumerian culture, depict what we would look at as an ancient rocket ship. They actually had a term called a Shem, which they explained that these Anunnaki would be orbiting in larger craft around the Earth, and then would use a Shem to then come as a landing pod down to Earth. And looks very similar to the idea of what we would do now, meaning we have landers and orbiters and things that would depart from, let's say, our shuttle or, space station and then go down to the planet's surface. So there seems to be, not only in the Sumerian culture, but others, even Hindu and some of these things that we would call a stupa. When you see Buddha sitting in a stupa, it looks essentially like some type of a conveyance of flight, like he could literally fly the stupa. So a lot of these depictions that we have from Sumerian culture do show evidence of rocket flight. A lot of people would ask, too, like, well, if they're so advanced, Anunnaki are coming from another planet, why are they using rockets? I don't know, George, but there's enough evidence to substantiate that. There's a famous king called Gilgamesh. And in one of his stories, again recorded in Sumerian cuneiform, Gilgamesh visits Baalbek in Lebanon. But at a time before it was Lebanon, it was just Baalbek. And there weren't cities stacked on these great platforms. It was just a big landing platform. Those megalithic stones at one point at Baalbek were just a huge platform. And literally, Gilgamesh explains that he, here at Baalbek, witnessed the gods coming down from the heavens and ascending into the heavens as well, using some type of a craft that he described as having great thunderous sounds, fire and smoke. Sounds pretty much like a rocket launch.
It sure does.
And as we're touching on with the Sumerians and the rocket ships, I mean, they're definitely one of the first cultures that seems to describe the use of the conveyance of flight. One of their seals actually shows a scene where it's the gods bringing a farmer up to one of the kings, and they're granting him the plow. It's like the age of modern agriculture.
Yeah.
But as a backdrop, it's VA-243. Anyone can just Google it, VA-243. But that seal, as a backdrop, shows a complete model of our solar system with all the planets that we know of, and the sun is in the center. Now, just below that, there appears to be, George, a rocket sitting on a launch pad with those two arms holding it up so that, like when the rocket would launch, one of the arms kind of falls away. That's literally what you see in the seal. Right below the solar system, they put a little rocket on a launch pad. What's interesting is that at that time, 3000 BC, the Sumerians are clearly depicting that they knew we orbited the sun. But what happens is we descend from 3000 BC and go down further until we reach the Dark Ages. We forget all this knowledge. And then it's not until the time where we come out of the Dark Ages and it's the Renaissance, and we have Galileo and Copernicus, and then they start to rediscover what it seems the Sumerians and ancient Egyptians had very, standard knowledge of.
Saddam Hussein being in control of Iraq for so long, many of us assumed that it was because he was controlling oil or had nuclear weapons, but in fact, he had something of a much greater asset, which was he controlled access to the temples that housed the history of humanity's origins. Potentially the secrets of literally what we see in the film on Sci-Fi Channel, Stargates and stuff like that.
Right. Do you believe that Saddam knew what he had?
Based on the info that came out of Iraq, what basically went down was there were a series of events. One of them was basically like an Iraqi Roswell. Something happened in 1998 where even on CNN there was a triangle formation of lights that appeared over Baghdad, and CNN's night vision video cameras caught this on tape. And as this thing was slowly moving around the city, most of the people that are ufologists realized the connection that this looked just like what we saw in the Phoenix lights. So it's very possible that, yes, maybe something crashed UFO-wise in Iraq that Saddam got his hands on, and we were more fearful of him reverse engineering the technology like we're doing, and that was the threat to make us need to go in there.
A second time, you mean?
That's correct. The only tie-in I would say to the first intrusion to Iraq was this, is that the reason why we didn't get him then, rumors were then, was that he was hiding out in some of these ziggurat pyramids that, again, just the wealth of historical of human information of our origins, it was just not something we could bomb. At a time when man did live amongst his living gods, we built these awesome temples and worship places where we went and actually conversed with them or took down sacred information from them. But at some point in our past, they left. The gods, let's just call them the gods, left. And so the high priests and the people in charge of the now established religions are panicking. Oh, my God, the gods have left. How do we maintain order and worship? So that's where all the statues and things come in. And there's this whole mix-up of why today we still have temples and churches, and they say don't practice false idols and gods, because it's this whole convoluted information, which for myself, I have transgressed to where did this come from? Where did these stories first show up?
What are the earliest artifacts, Sumerian artifacts we have that inform you about this lost culture, this lost period of time in Mesopotamia?
Sure. Well, roughly what we're talking about age-wise is 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC. And to put that into perspective, we're basically about 2,000 years removed from when the time of Christ was here, BC to AD, 2,000 years. So if you go back to that point and you add on another 2,000 years before that, you're at the Hebrew God of Abraham. Go back another 2,000 years from there, you're at the time of the Sumerians. So we're talking about a long time ago, and very interestingly enough, as it's still recorded in our educational institutions today, we attribute this culture coming right out of the Stone Age with over 100 of the firsts needed for high civilization. And it's really a paradox because they don't teach kids in school today that it's an amazing thing, kids. Here we have, right out of the Stone Age, the most amazing and advanced culture that we have record of, and then it kind of goes down and comes back up and goes down and comes back. So it's a very interesting story to tell. So basically the decipherment of writing on the clay tablets discovered in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, like, ancient Iraq, have led us to a wealth of information that, again, parallel ancient biblical tales that we have in the Bible. One of those, the most famous ones, is the story of Noah's Ark. And very interestingly enough, when the British archaeologists first started doing excavations in Iraq, there was an assistant to the British Museum, a gentleman named George Smith, who was also able to read ancient Akkadian. They found various tablets in Sumerian, actual Sumerian, describing this tale of, the Noah's Ark, and it was in a longer tale called Enuma Elish, which was an Akkadian version. So they could tell almost word for word that this Akkadian version was an identical reference of the Sumerian one. Unfortunately, the Sumerian one was broken up, and they only found pieces and fragments. But this Akkadian one proved not only that the Sumerian must have been the original, but word for word, the Akkadian matches what we now have today as the English version in Noah's Ark. This tablet is stored on display in the British Museum, called the Flood Tablet. And why the story of this is so amazing is, in 1898, this archaeologist found this tablet, and then bringing it back to Great Britain in the early 1900s, he was throwing his hands up in amazement, telling everyone, I can't believe that this actually exists, because here we have, for the first time, hard evidence, an artifact to prove that this tale might actually be truth and not just mythology.
What other early inventions can we trace back to Sumeria, which we have artifacts of now, which we sort of lost to civilization for a period of time?
Also gained. The interesting thing is that they were the ones to first invent writing, and not only writing, they also had the first inventions of mathematics, very accurate records of astronomy, medicine, laws, courts and judges, systems of law, schools and institutions of education. These all, kingship, a king, and followers in that order, all of this originated in Sumer. So one of the things that I focused on of interest to me was, one, their mathematics, and two, their astronomy. Their system of mathematics was based on a system called sexagesimal. Most people think that's 60, but in fact it was actually a combination of two. It was the number 10 and the number 6, and in doing so, they could do a very large divisible range of very high and small numbers. And so again, right out of the Stone Age, we have this culture that are like using fractions that they were aware of, like 3/4, 1/2, 1/4, 1/16, 1/64. They had all these breakdowns, and all of this was divisible by 12.
And your belief is then that the reason they were able to make this jump, going from the Stone Age to this advanced age, was because of an extraterrestrial intervention.
That's correct. And just analyzing some of the feats and things that they had, one has to ask, as people have done, like the renowned scholar Zechariah Sitchin, some of these, though, outside of what, even Sitchin has recorded, we have just around the world knowledge of. And one of those is like the Baghdad battery, where we have, on display in a museum, a very ancient copper battery. It's just a clay, cylinder that's aligned with copper, and when filled with a weak acidic acid, actually does generate electricity. And this is a very interesting thing to realize, that could it be that ancient man actually even harnessed the power of electricity?
What could they have used it for?
Well, there's a lot of interesting things when we look at some of the carried over cultures, like the Egyptian culture, where we have extensive hieroglyphics drawn inside of these, pyramids and tombs. And for the most part, in some degrees, they can't find any carbon being burnt on the ceilings, meaning it's obviously a very articulate job they did, and would painstaking over time to write and inscribe these hieroglyphics, and they would need light to do that in these deep recesses of the tombs and stuff. So one of the theories has been that maybe they were using electricity, harnessed again from knowledge passed down from like Mesopotamia. We have in the Temple Dendera in Egypt, there are wall reliefs of what look like Egyptians holding basically light bulbs, huge light bulbs. And these are just little things that, some of us found along the way. Erich von Daniken, again, one of the great archaeologists to question some of these. And along with the light bulb depictions, it seems that, there's these like pillar-like objects referenced several times that, modern archaeologists say, well, this is just a symbol of great religious consistency having to do with, power and kingship. But it could actually be that it was actually more like a power plant, a source of power. So it's a very interesting thing that when we look at the artifacts and stuff that they've left us, and someone would ask, well, why can't we just pull out one of these ancient computers or find some Stargate that's buried somewhere? And it's a very anomalous pattern, but it seems as if we do find these type of things in Egypt or in ancient Iraq, that the powers that be are well aware that they do exist,
right,
and make a strong effort to quell the public's knowledge in finding out the true information.
Jason, I asked this question. We see scientists such as the ones in Singapore and in Australia that have been doing the research into this, what they call the Flores Man, the Flores Caves,
yes,
on this island, and they believe that this separate species of human was maybe no taller than 3 feet tall,
right?
But that they believe that the skeletons are 800,000 years old. How do you reconcile that with your theories?
Well, I understand, and this is like, for instance, the work of Michael Cremo and various others who have shown that man could have gone so far back that there's, prints in South America and various other places that show man walking along dinosaur,
right?
Or that they go back, very, very long periods of time. What I've focused on is that the first recorded culture that we have, a first civilized culture, meaning not just some fragmented painting here, but who was the first to have a complete written language, a complete system of law and order.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is basically where we're at today. Is it rests on the shoulders of the Sumerians. The story that comes along with the Sumerians is, for instance, in the Bible, again, we have an English version, Genesis, that explains how the earth formed and how God created man and in 7 days did all these things. Well, there's also a Sumerian tale that's recorded on 11 tablets. Again, we have the Akkadian version of this tale. The Sumerian one was only fragmented pieces, but the Akkadian version, almost word for word what the Sumerian version says, is called the Enuma Elish, and it has a very much more detailed explanation for not only how the solar system was formed, how Earth came about, but also how man came about. And the Sumerian version, which is a very interesting tale, spells out how 300,000 years ago, a race of beings called the Anunnaki came here from another planet within our own solar system, seeking gold and other fine precious elements, came here and wanted to mine the gold found in the mines of southern Africa, just naturally appeared there. So they didn't like having to mine it themselves. It's a very hard toil to take gold out of the mines. And so they created, as the stories say, a worker race. And basically this first version was not able to procreate and was just a worker race for them. So the tale goes on to tell us that the Anunnaki eventually learned how to make us have like the Adam and the Eve. And this tale, again, is recorded in a Sumerian tale. Just like there is a Garden of Eden, there was actually a Sumerian city called Eden. And so a lot of these similarities very specifically explain how we were brought about, and the Sumerian information, as translated by Zechariah Sitchin, explains that there was a pre-hominoid man already here, the Neanderthal man, if you will, and the Anunnaki came here and took part of this pre-hominoid man, 20% of their genes, and combined it with their Anunnaki gene to make us, the Homo sapien.
Where does myth play into this? What percentage of your beliefs in these ancient artifacts and in the Anunnaki, how much of it do you actually think of as being historically 100% provable true, and at what percent you just kind of hold out there as kind of an interesting theory?
Well, Ian, for me, I was raised as a Christian. So a lot of the things that were enunciated in the Bible and prognosticated, live in the Word of God and stuff, I didn't quite understand, and it didn't really fulfill my need for the answers I had. So in my own quest, there's two parts of that. When I share the things that have impacted the feeling I have now, or what I make up my opinion on, I have to base it upon facts and things that I can share with other people to let them make up their own decision. So for me, what I share as far as the Sumerians and the information I've gathered, I believe to be true and actually authentic. Now, the overall encompassing meaning of the information and where it's taking us, I don't know. But I do believe that when I say myth and stuff like that, it's that modern archaeology and linguists today, basically when they started finding these artifacts from the Sumerian civilization, when they see things like the winged beings and when it's talking about the outer planets and things like that, they didn't understand what this meant, so they just put it into a big pile called mythology.
It sounds like this research replaced your previous belief system in a way that you believe you can articulate this and you can hold this to be true, and that this means something to you in a kind of spiritual way.
Well, for me, it's basically taking science and religion, merging the two to get a more accurate picture, because science and religion always butt heads. Is it creationism? Is it Darwinian evolution? So for me, I found that the merging of these two fields, and not just myself, but the research done by others looking along these type of lines, have found that it's very possible that, yes, there was no missing link. There was genetic intervention.
So the Anunnaki and this intervention that happened, in your beliefs, then the Anunnaki, they come in, they gather up these people that they're trying to create as being sort of a worker race, as I heard you refer to them earlier. They're trying to elevate this culture and trying to get them to participate in a larger sense, a collective, and then the Anunnaki disappear. And they leave behind this group that then has to kind of go through this process of trying to understand itself without their living gods living amongst them anymore.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Okay. Did the Anunnaki die? I mean, is there any evidence, any archaeological evidence that's ever come up of giants that once roamed the earth?
Well, let me answer that in two ways. You mentioned earlier weapons of mass destruction, possibly, and where could they have gone, and did they use these type of weapons?
That was just something I was curious about, whether you saw any thought that this was a warring people, or that they had a lot of weapons, or that there could have been something catastrophic.
Right. Well, as far as the giants, that's a term, again, used in an English translation of the Sumerian term. Anunnaki is what they used to describe their gods, and that just meant those who from heaven come to earth.
Right.
The interesting tale of while they were here is that one of those aspects is, yes, at some point the gods left, and there's an actual tale here to describe from Zechariah Sitchin where the Sumerians actually disappeared to, because it was literally a sudden demise for where the Sumerian culture died off to. Many of the things that we, again, learn from them have been carried into cultures around the world, but the tale that Zechariah Sitchin explains is that it's a very interesting thing that in the Sumerian texts, they describe basically an evil wind that came across the Mediterranean Sea, like a death cloud, that caused excruciating pain to all living beings and animals, withered plants. And so Zechariah Sitchin explains in one of his books called Wars of Gods and Men, it's basically that two rivalry Anunnaki clans here on Earth, two opposing clans, used weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, to destroy one of their spaceports, if you will.
Wow.
And in doing so, this caused a nuclear fallout that wiped over the land. And so there's actual evidence where Zechariah Sitchin, in looking at the Sinai Peninsula where this took place, there's an actual blackened region to this day that still exists. And when they show geologists this and ask, what could cause this, they say the only thing that I can think of would be a volcanic eruption or a volcano. And they're like, well, there are no volcanoes in the Sinai Peninsula.
Right.
So this leaves the fact that there is some type of disturbance that took place that burnt the land long time ago that still there's evidence for. And we even have a Sumerian tale explaining that very possibly the weapons of mass destruction used on opposing Anunnaki clans could have been nuclear weapons.
But then where do the rival Anunnaki come into it? Do the Anunnaki that leave the Sumerians behind, do they leave voluntarily, or they are wiped out by this rival group?
Well, let me give you another aspect of the tale that will shed some light on this. The tale that we have in the English Bible of a Noah's Ark,
right,
is that basically God chose to let this flood take place, and man was wiped off the earth. The Sumerian version is almost the exact same detail, but in more specific. There were two main Anunnaki leaders here on Earth. It was Enlil and Enki. And, the creator of us was in favor of keeping us. And very specifically in this long tale, the Enuma Elish on 11 tablets, it describes how the planet that these beings come from, the Anunnaki come from a planet within our own solar system that they called Nibiru, which stood for Planet of the Crossing. And it was symbolized basically as a big glowing cross in the sky. Again, this is 4,000 years before Christianity, and saying, let's symbolize Christ as a cross, being on the cross, a symbolic reference to God.
Okay.
This is being used by the Sumerians 4,000 years before that. And they very specifically denoted that, these beings came from this planet. So we have several descriptions of what we call the winged disk that still represent, to this day, this home planet of the Anunnaki. In Egyptian cultures, the sun god Ra, it's a winged disk. So the Sumerians have a very long tale that describe when this planet passed by, it was known to cause catastrophic events here on Earth. One of those being a long time ago, this took place when this planet passed by Earth, the home planet of the Anunnaki called Nibiru, and we'll describe some of the technical aspects. This involves the word Planet X. But basically, they were aware that when Planet X, Nibiru, was going to pass by Earth, it was going to cause great catastrophe on Earth, mainly some of the ice sheets cracking off, great floods taking place all over the Earth. And there was a fallout between these two Anunnaki, Enlil and Enki, whether or not to actually save man, and the argument was, let them perish. They've become too numerous. They're spreading all over the earth with diseases and everything. So they decided to have them wiped off the earth. Now, after the flood, just like the Bible says, when the ark rested on Mount Sinai, and they sent out a bird to try and find, if there's land, finally it comes back with a branch. This is all recorded in the Sumerian version, mind you. I'm not telling you the Noah's Ark tale. This is the 4,000-year earlier version. Eventually, the Anunnaki, after this great flood, saw that, man was gone and came back down to analyze what had taken place and found a small group, Sumerian man, that had built the ship by the Anunnaki's request, just like the Noah's Ark tale, saw them on this mountaintop. They, some of the animals they had saved, brought with them. They were cooking. They smelt the burning meat, were hungry, and came down and saw this devastation and realized, wow, we really need man. They provide for us things that we need, not only, as we've heard in the Bible, where they took the daughters of man as their wives, which is another tale. There was a whole other partnership that took place after this great flood where the gods, if you will, our ancient gods, looked at us in a new way and decided to say, well, we need man. This needs to be more of a partnership. And so then this question, as you've asked, where are they today or where have they gone? Did they leave? Goes into some very interesting aspects of, let's just call it ufology.
Do the Anunnaki then leave voluntarily? Are they wiped out in this battle in the rival Anunnaki factions?
There isn't really a clear answer as to why they left or where they have gone.
Okay.
My answer for that, this is kind of off the topic, and it's my own personal opinion, but based on my research with ufology and the government cover-up of things, I believe that maybe Earth is on quarantine. So if there is some, let's just call it galactic federation or federation of planets, however that would work, smart races out there that, collaborate, they would look upon us, I would believe, and say, wow, we're killing each other, blowing up the planet, expelling natural resources. Let's just let them get there on their own, maybe give them a nudge or two, but I don't think they're going to let us in to have access to the things like the Anunnaki once gave us because of how we screwed up in the past.
Well, but, how dare they feel so howdy about that if they blew themselves up with ancient weapons of mass destruction?
Well,
how advanced were they if they, in their own tales, record a nuclear-like explosion between rival Anunnaki?
Well, that's why I would say that more than likely, if there is a federation of planets, maybe they're kind of like not allowed to visit us right now or not allowed to intervene. And the only side note I would say to that is there is another interesting aspect of some of the Sumerian information where they had another group of Anunnaki that were called Igigi. So there were two forms of Anunnaki. There were the ones that came down here to actually work amongst the humans and work with the kings and priests of high command and establish rulership here on Earth. But then there were also forms of Anunnaki that were just called Igigi, which were beings that were from this planet that did not actually come here, but assisted in many other areas of the Anunnaki. And there are several Sumerian tales that explain that these Igigi had helpers, and there are tales throughout the Bible and stuff. You've heard the terms like the Watchers or the Nephilim, and it's very possible that the Anunnaki, if they did create us in their image and after their likeness using genetic engineering, they could basically splice together genes from other races. And there's lots of tales in their texts about how they didn't just try it with man. They had success combining their genes with animals. And like you have these references of the Sphinx and various other, the Matador and other things throughout history that come to fruition in the Sumerian tales.
You're just saying those weren't necessarily mythological beings.
That's right. They weren't necessarily mythological.
That we were some big giant island of Dr. Moreau.
Well, one of the other things that they've left us in the form of text describing their interaction with this certain type of being, but also figurine descriptions of these little helpers of the Anunnaki, which coincidentally look just like our modern-day gray alien. And they said that these were the helpers of the Anunnaki that assisted in, let's say, medical experiments or sometimes flying their craft. And, they have a very strong resemblance to what we would call the modern-day gray alien. So I would say that if it is, why aren't they here? Why don't we see them? Maybe it's possible. And again, this is just my own assumption. Maybe they've kind of left us in the hands of, let's say, other overseers to kind of watch their grand experiment. Because whenever we hear about alien abductions or people being, sighted in that sense, it usually has to do with reproductive activities or, extraction of body fluids and tissue and things like that. So maybe they're relaying this grand experiment back to the Anunnaki, saying, hey, here's what's currently going on with your race of beings that you created. Yeah, that's a hard one to swallow, though.
Yeah, it is.
We'll look at some more of the astronomical data, too, to show that they weren't just making this up. They have recorded, documented evidence that they knew something taught to them.
But bottom line was, to go back to someplace in this timeline of our conversation, no archaeological record of giant people or any bones that cannot yet be accounted for that come out of Mesopotamia that would anyway indicate that there was a mortality to these Anunnaki.
If you're asking me if we found any Anunnaki bones yet, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, because it seems like the farther back in time we go with our human anthropological record, is the further back we go, the smaller we get.
As far as the Nephilim go, this is a tale, in the Sumerian version, that the Nephilim, described in the Hebrew Bible, are gods, if you will, that took the daughters of men. So we have the same tales in the Sumerian legend that at some point when man started to flourish, they realized that, the women were attracted to them, and so they took the wives that they wanted. But this term Nephilim is thought as a negative connotation, like evil beings in the heavens. So it's a really interesting thing that the Anunnaki, this term Nephilim isn't really used as a Sumerian word. It's just a translated term of Anunnaki, meaning those who from heaven come to earth.
But I don't know that there's a thought that they were evil. I just think that there was a sense that they were powerful.
That could be. It's just most terms, the Nephilim is referred to like the Watchers, the Nephilim, the fallen ones. It's like they fell out of grace with God, and so that's why they were sent here. You know, the angle that I'd like to touch on for the last hour here is where these beings come from, and more specifically, you know, will they ever come back? You know, the Sumerians, again, with their tablets and the writings that they've left us, a large profusion of the text had to deal with astronomy. And to put into perspective what they said, you know, we have several tablets that describe observation of weather patterns and natural occurrences, patterns in the sky as far as the star constellations. Over hundreds of years they made these observations and recorded them on stone. There was even a set of tablets that for any scholar that could actually read these, a Sumerian scholar that could read these texts, would be able to tell you 50 years in advance on what specific day a lunar eclipse would take place. So they had very accurate knowledge of recording events in the heavens, even to the point where, to this day, we don't quite understand how they were able to know the distance between the planets, the way the planets look in space, meaning the color of the planets. They cited Uranus and Neptune as being mosh sieg, a bluish-green color, Neptune being the twin of Uranus. And this is information that we had no knowledge of until in the late 70s and 80s. We sent probes like the Voyager and the Pioneer, and we finally got color pictures. They collaborated word for word what the Sumerians described as a bluish-green planet, the distance between the planets. But then it gets into some specific areas that we haven't been able to confirm yet, like the planet X.
With all these probes and all the other stuff going out there in space, is there anything new that you're hearing?
Well, yes. I mean, the current research is still continuing as far as the search for a planet beyond Pluto. We've had several blips show up on the radar that really haven't done anything other than raise the eyebrows of awareness for, could there be a planet X out there? In the last few years, there has been a great resurgence in the idea of, is there a planet beyond Pluto? We found a couple of these bodies, Sedna, Quoar, you might have heard some of these in the news, where they found basically anywhere from 800 kilometers to 1,000 kilometer in radius size planetoids is what they call it. They're just big ice balls floating out there beyond Pluto that they weren't aware of. What I'm talking about actually is an object that would be 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. Big object. And there is research that's been going on since about the early 80s, where it started off with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Harrington, who was the lead scientist for the Naval Observatory in Washington. And he detected perturbations in the outer planets, which basically means that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were exerting a certain nudge in a direction that led the scientists to believe there's some other large body beyond Pluto that's exerting this pull on the planets, yet we can't account for what it is. So then they started to do a lot of imaging using infrared satellites and telescopes to look way out into the solar system to find what could be causing this anomalous pull. And this led into the whole topic and realization of when we talk about brown dwarfs and failed stars and stuff like that, with the use of the Hubble, it's become almost a standard norm with the other solar systems we filmed, to see that they're binary, meaning they have two suns. So it's very possible that our own solar system is binary, that our other sun that's way, way, way out there, billions of miles away, out beyond this thing called the Oort cloud, it's very possible we, too, have another sun, but it's a failed sun, a brown dwarf.
A brown dwarf.
And so what happens is that there's been a lot of research and theories going back to one of them called Nemesis, saying that this sun out there, this failed sun, perhaps has comets and debris that somehow get pulled into our inner solar system on a very high-level orbit. And one of the postulations was why the dinosaurs died off was because this Nemesis, this planet that passed around that failed sun, disturbed comets and sent them towards us, and at very large intervals, like the dinosaurs dying off, caused extinction-level events. Now, where this ties into the Sumerian planet X is that the Sumerians say that this planet, Nibiru, has a very elongated 3,600-year orbit around our sun. So for us, a solar day is 365 days. It's one loop around the sun. One loop around the sun for Nibiru is 3,600 of our years. So it's a very, very long elliptical orbit which takes it far out into space, and people have postulated, well, what could cause it to come looping back and not just be wandering out there in space is maybe that's another sun that it loops around and sends back towards us.
If it's described as being a planet like with mountains and waters, and sounds very similar perhaps to the environment of Mesopotamia, right?
Well, Mesopotamia is actually it's not a very mountainous region as much as it's got a lot of clay.
Well, okay, but there's not mountains wouldn't be out of the question if you're going to have.
Of course not. No.
Right. So all I'm saying is that you've got that type of a composite image of what Planet X was. Then how could it also have been, or how do we reconcile that with this image of it being another sun?
Well, it's not actually that Nibiru would be another sun, but there's actually another sun that Nibiru loops around and gets shot back towards us. Interestingly enough, Ian, about 4 months ago, I attended a conference at Jet Propulsion Laboratories by a Dr. Michelle Fowler, and we have a new telescope that we just launched in space. It's called the Spitzer telescope. It was first called Surtif, but they renamed it after this famous astronomer Spitzer. And I asked Dr. Michelle Fowler, who's the lead astronomer on this project, is it possible that this new satellite, Spitzer, will be able to image things like a Planet X? And do you believe that it's possible an object 4 to 8 times the size of Earth could be in our solar system?
Right.
And very interestingly, she said, yes, I do believe that it's possible. Whether or not Spitzer would be able to see it, I don't know. This telescope looks at very specific areas in the solar system, but already in doing so, in the 4 months that it's been released, they've had an exponential growth as far as extrasolar planets, white dwarfs, brown dwarfs. And so this has been the overriding problem with modern search for Planet X, is that off the scale, we find thousands of these wandering planets, let's call them, out there beyond what we call the Kuiper belt or the Oort cloud, but could still possibly be something that passes through our solar system.
Okay.
So it's not a question of does Planet X exist, it's will we be able to actually pinpoint which of these orbiting planets or wandering stars it is.
The book, The 12th Planet, a book that has stood archaeology, history, and a lot of other sciences on its ear. There are some who say, well, Sitchin must have, he must have made up some of this stuff. Good heavens, there is no way anybody could make up what is in the 12th planet. And Professor Sitchin, I must ask you, how many languages has it been printed in?
Just call me Zecharia.
All right, Zecharia.
I lost count. I think about 24 or 25.
Which is more languages than you read. Now, you read a heck of a lot of them.
Yes. Well, some of them are Greek to me.
Zecharia, we've been friends for a long time. And there are a number of questions that I've wanted to ask, and this is the night. But the very first question I have to ask you, how in the world, I can understand how you learned to read Hebrew. You lived in Israel for years. It's not too unusual for people to read Hebrew. Of course, ancient Hebrew is a little different kind of thing. But to read the clay tablets of the Sumerians from 6,000 years ago, where did you learn to do this? How did you do this? There are so very few people in the world that can do this.
Well, the answer will take up too much of our time because it was a process that required decades, really decades. All I'll say is, Hilly, to all your listeners, don't try.
A lot of us wonder if Mr. Sitchin is telling all he knows about what he has found over the years, or is he releasing what he has been allowed to release via the government? In other words, are you at all being censored by the government? So many people believe the government knows a lot more about UFOs, for example, than they tell us.
Well, I'm not a spokesman for the government, but I can assure all my readers that I'm not being constrained or told by anybody except maybe a higher authority in the spiritual, religious, or faith sense, what to write at what time, and And as to the key element of the question is, have I already written or spoken at my various previous seminars and told everything that I know or I think I know? And the answer is no. And I've been working the last few years on at least one more book, and in that book I hope to conclude to tell what I believe really happened in the past and what is going to happen in the future.
In other words, you're going to predict the future?
Well, not predict, but foretell. I think is the difference.
As you're reading of the Sumer tablets, is that correct?
The tablets, the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament's Book of Revelation, and all other available sources.
Where the Anunnakis are today. You have got a couple of chapters in your book called When the Gods Fled from Earth, so pretty much you've answered the question there, but do you have any further thoughts on where the Anunnakis are today?
Oh, I do have not just thoughts. I think I have some facts and figures, figures being mostly matters of dates, and that's what I intend to tell in my hopefully forthcoming book.
So they still exist, as far as you know?
Oh, yes, they do.
Okay. Now, these, for people who may not have read your books, these Nephilims came from the 12th planet, which is a planet quite near our planet. And they descended to Earth. I'm not trying to tell your story here, but just quickly to state it. And they, how shall I say, intermingled, intermixed. They brought knowledge to the Homo sapiens that we could not have had any other way. Basically, is that correct?
Well, that's basically the story, yeah.
All right.
The story at the beginning. That's the beginning of the story.
That's all right. Now, the end, maybe something...
May I point out, Hilly, that the book that you have mentioned, and I appreciate your very kind words about it, was the first book of 10. There are 10 books by now, and each book that followed the 12th planet builds on the previous one, continues the story, looks at the events that happened from different viewpoints or different geographical areas. There's a book called The Lost Realms that deals with the Americas. There's a book titled Divine Encounters that deals with the subject of divine encounters and dreams and visions and angels. There is a book titled The Lost Book of Enki, which tells the story in the words of Enki, one of the leaders of the Anunnaki who came here, in his own words. So the subject has been covered in many ways and in many stages. So I would like to point this out to your listeners, so that they shouldn't think that just to remain at phase 1, because there's been phase 2 and phase 3, and then that's gradually leading to a foretelling of what's to come, which would be hopefully the last phase.
Well, you point out in your books that 12 is a very important number, yeah. And so I hope you will write 12 books. But I ask people to go to your website and to look at the pictures, the NASA pictures of what's on Mars. From Mars,
yes.
And you say that this makes the rest of it irrelevant because it proves once and for all that there are man-made structures on Mars. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, except I always try to find another term rather than man-made, because if man means, you and I, or somebody like us, then it's really the Anunnaki, so Anunnaki-made.
All right. What is there... Now, you've pointed this out to NASA. You've tried to communicate with them, but they refuse to communicate back to you. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know if they refuse. They just don't answer.
They just don't answer you. Well, if I send them some email is one thing, but someone of your stature to send them email and say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? That's pretty important. Now, the pictures that are there, you have enlarged and enhanced, but you also have included the actual NASA photos for people to see for themselves.
Yeah, they can click and go straight to the NASA website that has those photographs.
Well,
which is quite a complex thing to do, but by clicking on my website, they can just get there.
Well, what's about these pictures? I mean, to me, they look like sand dunes.
These are pictures taken by the rover, one of the two that were sent to Mars. I think that it's the one called Spirit, that was stuck for a while in some kind of a valley or I don't know. Anyway, some depression and in the surface of Mars, and then climbed up and reached the rim of that depression or valley, and the camera started to sort of scan the landscape to see what does one see from the top of that rim of that depression, and NASA posted the photographs, with some identification, the such and such, picture number such and such, etc. And some of them show, without doubt, what we would call artificial structures, walls, angled walls, a tower-like structure, etc. And what I did was I posted them on my website, Sitchin.com, and just asked the question. I said, would Mr. NASA please explain what this is? And nobody did to this day.
And you believe that this proves that it was some kind of intelligent force that created these sand structures?
These are not sand structures. These may be sand-covered structures, but these are walls, angled walls, 90 degrees walls, rounded towers, rectangular areas.
Which proves, I've got to stop here, which proves that it's some intelligence.
Intelligent work by somebody that had some technology and technical ability.
Robert Stanley's back with us.
So I started doing some more research about this whole concept, which I've told you and your audience before, that I'd been given some clues that Lucifer not only was real, but that he had a real problem. He suffers from multiple personality disorders, and he also has inadvertently he's infected himself with these mental parasites that he accidentally created, he and his immediate
his cohorts,
spacefaring crew. Yeah, well, and I had told you before that the information I got was from a book called Christ Consciousness by a guy named Norman Paulson, who was a friend of my father. Now, in there, he claims that back in the 1950s, he was contacted by benevolent human extraterrestrials who told him this story about how Lucifer had ventured into some weird forbidden zone, like a black hole, and he was so badly traumatized, he and his crew, that they became insane. They went mad. And I told you I thought maybe that somehow that he was infected from a source external to our universe. But after I went back, last time we talked, I went back and reread that information. It says very clearly there that when they were in the forbidden zone, wherever that may be, and they went insane, that is when they accidentally created these mental parasites, which have various names, such as demons or archons or jinn.
All right.
Okay, so, and those things are extremely real. They're very dangerous, and they're very prevalent in affecting our consciousness negatively.
So you do not believe that Lucifer was a fallen angel?
Well, okay, let's be clear here. The word angel just is Greek. It means messenger. I don't see him as a messenger. Before he went mad, he was a builder of worlds. He and the people that work with him They were
from another planetary system or something else.
Yeah, it's not the 12th planet or 10th planet, whatever. It's not Nibiru. He literally came from the Orion constellation. He comes from a royal family. You can read about this in Sitchin's work. He's the one known as Enki.
Okay. All right. That's who he is. All right.
Well, that is who he is. I know this really I'm sorry. Look, I have to apologize up front. I know this upsets people when I say this, but it's just the way it is, okay? And also I'd like to clarify, I do not hate or fear Lucifer or Enki or whatever you want to call him. The guy has so many different names, it's a little bit absurd sometimes to try and keep up with it. But he is a real person. He's also a shapeshifter. My understanding is he's an amphibinoid, a humanoid that is amphibious. We know this from the descriptions of him in the Persian Gulf. He's known as Oannes, coming up out of the water and giving mankind civilization, as it were.
What does he look like?
Now here's the problem. As a shapeshifter, he can look like anybody that he wants
at any time.
At any time. So a lot of people have met him and didn't know it. And even I didn't know it, George. That's the other thing I should clarify. When I spoke to you 2 years ago, I said that radiant being of light that I met on the mountain in Malibu in 1985, I wasn't sure who that was. All he said to me was he's the father.
Did you think it was a godlike figure at the time?
Well, of course.
Yeah,
of course.
who wouldn't?
Yes, but I was being attacked by the mental parasites that I encountered earlier that day when I was working security at the beach in Malibu. And so when I was up on that mountain praying for help, and when he showed up looking like Jesus, I thought that he was there to help me. At the time, I had no idea that was Lucifer, and that he was the one that had created these parasites. And basically the reason he was confronting me is because I was interrupting his agenda.
And he knew it.
Oh, of course he knew it. Yes, of course I didn't know it, and it was really confusing to me. And even when I spoke to you 2 years ago, I still didn't know that was Lucifer. It was only shortly after our conversation that a lot of things clicked into place, and they're still clicking into place, which, in a way it's good. But I got to tell you, having this information, I suppose, is a blessing because I think it's important that we know it. But it's also kind of personally, it's a curse because I can't get away from it. I mean, I wouldn't choose to do that. At this point, let's just put it this way. It's a really big responsibility for me to report this accurately because it is affecting everybody to some degree.
Why would Lucifer be in Malibu?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's what I wondered too. But apparently, he considers this entire planet to be part of his empire, his illegitimate empire that he started. We don't know. I'm guessing over 400,000 years ago. That's my estimation. At least that's when he came here and turned this world from a paradise planet that his mother and brother had first established essentially as an experiment. It was going to be, if it went well, it would have been a blueprint for the rest of the Orion Empire. But when Lucifer went mad, and he eventually found his way out. He and his crew eventually found their way out of the Forbidden Zone, and they were like rabid dogs. They'd gone completely insane, and they were dangerous. He made his way home back to the court of Orion. His parents said, even though he was firstborn and he was the next heir to the throne, the kingship of that empire, that galactic empire, they said, there's no way that we can't allow you to ascend to the throne, because you're mentally unstable. And he said, well, then the heck with you guys. I will start my own empire. That's where the war in heaven started. And eventually, it wasn't his ego. It was his mental state. He's broken. His spirit is fractured.
How has he been able to live so long? I mean, you just mentioned 400,000 years.
Yes. Well, okay. We're talking about divine beings, gods, goddesses that are shapeshifters. They are interdimensional. They're not just extraterrestrial. And the reason we don't live very long here is because of his tampering, his genetic modifications that he's done to us to cause us to be have an expiration date.
It's like a time clock in us or something.
Well, it's a way of controlling us. he does that to us originally, intentionally. Not only do we have our physical life shortened, but when we pass over, there's this soul trap that he has instituted that causes us to reincarnate back here. They trick us into agreeing to come back here and still be under their control, because part of the problem is, like what he did to me in Malibu that night, was he erased my memory of most of that night. And he does that to us every time we reincarnate. They reinforce their control over us by erasing our memory of the previous lifetime. So it makes us much easier to control.
With what we know of as Satan, is that Lucifer?
Yes. No, that is... Oh, God, here we go. Very controversial. No, my understanding is that is his son, Marduk. He's also known, in the Egyptians' pantheon, he was known as Ra.
What a great family this must be, Robert, huh?
Well, no. Here, come on. Let's be fair. These are divine. I know it doesn't make sense, okay, but I've had to come to grips with this. My first reaction, George, when I finally realized who I was dealing with, I was pretty upset. You can imagine. Nobody likes being lied to.
Right.
But one of his titles is the father of all lies. He's not just doing it to me, okay? And he's incapable of telling the truth. I mean, I don't know. Have you met anybody ever that has multiple personalities?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Okay. They're very they're incoherent in the sense that you never know which personality you're dealing with, and there's an internal conflict going on. So they lack integrity. So here's the thing. I told you before, evil is an infection, and I can prove that now. I found the evidence over the weekend. I'm really jazzed right now. There's no way they can deny this any longer. You know, the reason they hide and do what they do covertly is because they know that we're not stupid. And at some point, if we figure this out, that we will take action individually and collectively to liberate ourselves. And they don't want that. They actually need us on some level, because they have become parasitic and predatory, and they feed off of, as I told you before, they feed off the negative energy that's released through our DNA when we hurt ourselves or others. This is why they're constantly provoking us, right? Dividing us and provoking us to do harm.
How did you learn all this? How did you find the information?
It's taken over 30 years of research to be able to have the conversation we're having right now. And I know it sounds fantastic when people hear me, especially for the first time. They must think I'm mad. But I'm actually a professional researcher. I did that for 8 years for Honda. I actually worked at the research and development facility, and I put together timelines. So I know how to do professional research, not just offer my personal opinion, although there's some of that too. Okay, so I draw on many sources. You know, it used to be journalists actually did a job where they had to vet their sources, and they would never publish a story unless there was at least two different sources that they found to be credible.
That's right.
So I like to think that I'm one of the last journalists that actually is, remaining, like yourself. Most people nowadays engage in punditry.
We're a dying breed, Robert.
Yeah, it's sad, but I mean, and look, I understand everybody wants to get their opinion out there, but since you asked, it's the reason I have been so adamant about trying to find out this information to understand his agenda is because it so directly impacted my life. I mean, if you just imagine, you're standing face to face with this God, this madman, the fallen angel, whatever you want to call him, and he is affecting my thought process.
Tricking you, right?
Trying to trick, and he did. He tricked me for 29 years, had me under the influence, or at least believing that he was a God or the Father. And so at this point, I just have to jump ahead, give you a further update. When I spoke to you in 2014, what I knew at that point, that he would be returning under the false pretense that he was here to save us. And this is going to be sanctioned by the UN and the Vatican. The reason he's coming back is because this is to complete the final stage of his agenda currently, which is to take a contingent of human beings, upgrade them to a cyborg level through AI, nanotechnology, nanobots. Those few humans that have been so-called upgraded are going to be part of a strike force that he teleports or sends through a portal directly to the court of Orion to attack on his behalf. So in other words, they'll become the point guard of his force. Now, my understanding is this was already tried back in the days of Atlantis. That's what he was doing a lot of that genetic experimentation for, and that's the main reason his parents, his family, wiped out pretty much all life on the planet, specifically his doing. The manipulation, the monsters that he had created then were wiped out. And as you know, I know a lot of your audience knows this too, America is considered the new Atlantis. At least that's what Francis Bacon wrote, right?
Right.
So it is what we are, what we've become, and this was all by design. None of it happened by our own doing.
Now let's look at the Luciferian principle and compare it to the agenda of what is really good, and that's the godlike end of it. When do those two collide, Robert? Because they're going to eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something else I had mentioned last time we spoke, was that there are contingency plans. His family hasn't just given up. It's not like they just want to wipe us all out. That's not the case at all. We are all related. We are all family. And they're very concerned, not only about us, but about their immediate son, Lucifer, Enki, whatever you want to call him. He is royal blood. He is their family, and they've been trying. It's really difficult to rehabilitate somebody when they don't want to be rehabilitated. And so this free will is a huge issue here. And this is one of the reasons that he tricks us into agreeing to doing things that are not in our best interest. The metaphor for that would obviously be Eve eating the apple. It's just a metaphor. I don't think that's exactly 100% accurate, but it serves a purpose for the sake of the conversation here. He's really good at manipulating people, us. You know what else I found out about him? He thinks he is the father of modern mankind. He also feels he's our savior. From his twisted perspective, he feels that because he genetically modified us to be what we are, that he is our father. He also feels because that he saved some of us, a remnant of his original creation here, his monstrosities, that he created here, he reestablished that here. He supposedly saved us from the flood and reestablished it. So, like I said, when he said he's the father, from his perspective, he actually believes that.
What's his bottom line, Rob? What does he want?
He wants total control. It's really weird about people like that have no self-control. It's easier to control others. What my understanding is that people have this disorder. If they can't control themselves, that when they control others, at least that's some degree of control that they have. You know, it's an illusion. It's not accurate, but that's for them. That's better than nothing, right?
But it's easy for people to get confused, misread what the situation is with this, as you did for so many years.
Oh, yeah, but see, it's done intentionally. Yeah, look, he didn't just fool me. He's fooled all of us to various degrees. I mean, there are some people that know who they're serving, and they do it willfully because they get rewarded for it.
I guess you would say, though, that Lucifer is not a good entity. Let's be really clear about this. I don't personally hate somebody if they're mentally ill, even if they're violent. You know, so some people have asked me, hey, why doesn't his family just kill him? Well, because they're family. They know he's insane, and that would not be the first choice. The first choice is to try to get him well. That hasn't worked.
Get it all well. Not yet, but here's the other thing. Remember we talked about hundreds of thousands of years, beings that live for considerably long time, right? Semi-immortal. So in the Bible it talks about 1,000 years is but a day to God. We have to start thinking on a much larger time scale. I know it's difficult for us because our lives have been so shortened artificially, and our minds have been so controlled artificially. Mm-hmm. But these beings can live a very, very long time, and they do not suffer from amnesia every time that they physically pass over either. So they have complete recall of who they are and have been for various lifetimes, and it's not difficult for them to have what we would consider really long-term planning.
But he's got cohorts. He's got followers.
Oh,
are they all insane too?
Unfortunately, yes. And this is what I was saying about finding proof. This is called mass hysteria. The mental health profession knows this. They know that they can find no physical cause for one person actually causing another person to becoming psychotic. But they see it. They've observed it under clinical conditions. So they know that there's a way that we transfer this, but they can't identify it. The Catholic Church would call this possession. The medical profession calls it schizophrenia. Now, both institutions are trying to do something about it, but unfortunately they're not being successful. So if we can't fix it here accurately, you got to understand that there's efforts going on behind the scenes by these divine beings, the ones that are still divine, that are uninfected. They're doing their best. The problem is, and this was explained to me very carefully, that we tend to, because of the circumstances, we tend to be easily tricked into agreeing to do these things. Now, if we agree, I say, okay, look, yes, I want to live forever as a cyborg. I want to become smarter and stronger and compete with AI, etc. Okay? If I agree to that, the divine beings, even though they may disagree, they may say, God, Robert, that's a really stupid idea. I mean, why would you do that? But they can't prevent me from doing it because that would be a violation of my free will. And they still abide by that.
Okay, now on the good side of it, the godlike figures, right?
Yes.
What's happening on that end? I mean, is there a battle going on? I mean, how long is this going to continue?
Yeah, well, until it's resolved. Okay, so when we think of a battle, we think the good guys and the bad guys, black and white, and there's a lot of shades of gray involved here. The good guys do not operate in the same way. They don't just go around killing people and blowing things up. That's not how they do it. You know, it's very different. It's a lot of times it's really subtle, and they also have to get our approval. You know, like I was just describing. So it's a lot more strategic. I feel it's a lot more subtle, but it's a lot more powerful and effective in the long run. I told you one of the contingency plans I saw when I asked them, how are you going to resolve this? Because honestly, it boggles my mind. How do you heal that many people from a condition that is so pervasive, so systemic? I mean, literally, somebody else actually called it this, a cancer of the consciousness. This is really bad. So what I was shown was that there was a wave of energy that would wash over the planet sometime in the future. And it turns out there's actually a few people that have seen this coming. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I am very confident that what I saw in my mind's eye was that this actually could happen sometime in the future, that as this energy wave passes over us, that our DNA would, instead of being so shut down, that it would suddenly be fully active. I mean, but okay, so think of it. If most people, their DNA has been shut down, switched off to some degree, they're on dial-up. Whereas some of us occasionally we have these awakenings, epiphanies, whatever you want to call it, revelation. That would be like suddenly having broadband data flow, right? And you're like, whoa, what is all this? You know, it's like it's just a flood of information of stuff that's really there, but it's like we just can't quite see it right now because we've been so dumbed down or switched off in many regards. So that would be the switching on of us, and I think at that point people would have a much greater clarity as to making good choices, or at least clear choices about what is it that we want. Do we want to be free? Because, remember we talked about this before, like people that are in prison for too long, when you let them out, they feel uncomfortable. They want to get back.
Of course, they want to go back.
Because they feel very uncomfortable when they're outside the prison system. So they can't reintegrate to society. So I feel that the same thing is true for a lot of people here. If given the choice of moving off of the prison world here, there are some people that are going to choose to stay living under those conditions, and that will be honored by the divine beings. When I first was shown that, I thought, no, that can't be right. That's not really a solution, is it? And they made it clear to me, it has to be that way.
Robert, is this a great deception?
Of course, the whole thing is an illusion. This is a good segue. Now, are you familiar with the cube on the North Pole of Saturn, that hexagonal shape? In other words, it's something that the Kabbalah and the big black square that the Islamic people go around. In other words, it's worshipped in multiple religions. The Israel, the Islamics, the Masonic Society, they all worship this Saturnian black cube. What that is a hyperdimensional tesseract. It looks like a cube, but it's a portal to another dimension. That is set up on Saturn as an extension of the larger original mother quantum computer tesseract that Lucifer created. Not only did he create his own empire, George, he created a matrix, a false universe. It's very small compared to the known universe, but it's where we are.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because Elon Musk, he says we're living in a false matrix computerized world. Yep.
What I feel is happening is that people are exponentially waking up, in part because of shows like this, through the Internet, despite all its deficiencies. The fact that we're having open conversations about this is having a change. Also, there was a shift in the energy / consciousness of this planet between 1987 and 2012. Everybody that went through that and is now on the other side of it is far more awake and alert than previously. This is a whole new ballgame we're in right now. And honestly, I feel the tipping point is coming. As far as consciousness is concerned, we are. If we haven't already made it there, I think we're very close to a tipping point where there is no return. There's just no way you can put the genie back in the bottle. I mean, look at the approval ratings of the media. People see through it now. They're tired of being lied to, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right, and that's the thing. People are not so easily fooled, and I think it's because there has been a huge shift in individual as well as collective consciousness, and I mean shifting towards an awakeness, an awareness that hasn't been on this planet for a very long time.
You have looked at things like new technologies, artificial intelligence, and you think all that plays a role in this deception, don't you?
Oh, I'm sure it does. Yeah, it's unfortunate, too, because I actually enjoy technology. I think
Me
when
too.
used correctly, it's just another tool. I think it can be very helpful. But it is, unfortunately, something that we have to be extremely careful about, because this is part of and parcel of Lucifer's, not only his empire, but his agenda for us.
Dr. Mike Heiser, expert in ancient languages, texts, and religions.
Well, I sort of got drawn into this in 2001 after I wrote a novel called The Facade, and it had nothing to do with Zechariah Sitchin. I had not heard of him. I had heard of Erich von Daniken
Sure.
At the time, and then so I started looking at Zechariah Sitchin, and at first I thought I'd found a kindred spirit, because this was, by the biographical description, someone who was into ancient Near Eastern studies and also into this sort of thing. It turned out what I sort of read when I got his books. I got the first two books and read them. It didn't sort of match what my own expectation was, and so I was constantly asked, to comment on this, and so I disagree on a number of issues with Zechariah Sitchin. I don't I don't look at some of the passages in the Bible and some of the Mesopotamian texts the way he does, as far as the idea of them presenting evidence for alien visitation and things like that. But I actually view it as a separate issue from the bigger question of, could there be extraterrestrials? Could they, have come here? Could they come here at some point? I mean, all those to me are separate issues, and they're not really revolving around, this particular issue or this particular person. So I disagreed with him on the basis of sometimes grammar, sometimes translation. I think our biggest, our sharpest disagreements are he has certain really key ideas that he asserts from Mesopotamian tablets. And if you actually go look, for instance, if you look for all the occurrences of Anunnaki, which anyone listening here can do, and some of the things he says about the Anunnaki just aren't there. And so that becomes a real sharp point of contention when I say, look, it's not a translation issue. It's an issue of, is it there or not? And it's not that he's really making it up. What he's doing is he's reading the story, and then he's assigning sort of a narrative over top of it, if that makes any sense. It's like if I read Tom Sawyer, and then for the characters in Tom Sawyer and the places and the events, I sort of put a narrative over that, sort of an interpretive web over that. That's really what he's doing. I mean, he's a smart guy. He's not just, I'm here to sort of make things up and fabricate things and all that sort of thing. It's really sort of a merging of his story that he's imagining on, some of these texts, and it's almost like an allegory, but of course he doesn't view it as an allegory. I think he's completely sincere, and he really feels that he's latched on to something here and really believes it.
I'd like his theories. When I picked up the 12th Planet, his first in a series of books on the Earth Chronicles, I was mesmerized by it. As I've been Edgar Casey and even you, Michael, with your work, of his interesting theory. So tell me, why is it because of your background in ancient languages and text, you believe he's interpreted them wrong? Is that the main issue?
Yeah, let's take the Anunnaki, for example. I mean, there are some really core ideas that he has. The idea that the Anunnaki came here by means of this route of the 12th planet, which in Sitchin's thinking is Nibiru. And so there's this connection between the Anunnaki and Nibiru. There's this 3,600-year cycle of Nibiru. So those are two ideas. And my fundamental problem is that if you actually go look up the Anunnaki, going up to a website called the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature, and there are hundreds of Sumerian texts, both in Sumerian transliteration and in English, and the video is of me putting in the Sumerian spelling for Anuna or Anunnaki.
Okay.
And then you get the results. And there's 180 occurrences of the Anunnaki in the Sumerian text.
So it does come up.
Oh, yeah. It's there a lot. Every one of these you can click through to the English translation. And if you do that, you're not going to find any reference to the Anunnaki and connected with Nibiru ever. You're not going to find, if you do it for Nibiru, these are core ideas to this particular theory. And my big problem is I don't see it in the text. So it transcends a translation issue at those specific points.
Well,
sometimes it is a translation issue.
Who were the Anunnaki? Who did they reference when they did mention 140 times the Anunnaki?
Yeah, the Anunnaki are a group of gods, depending on what era and what Mesopotamian text you're talking about. They can either be a group of gods or subgroup of the Sumerian pantheon. And they're doing all sorts of things. Usually it's kind of like the Old Testament or the Psalms. They're pictured in the divine throne room having conversations or praising Marduk or, rendering some decision. Your typical sort of pantheon kind of job description. So a lot of them are like that. Sometimes they do more specific things, like with the creation of man. The Anunnaki actually, in Enuma Elish and some of these other creation texts, the Anunnaki actually aren't the ones creating humanity, but they're there, and they're sort of like consulted by Marduk. Marduk says, well, I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing, and so there's a deity that's slain, and then they collect the clay from the earth and the blood of the god, and they make human beings. The Anunnaki aren't doing that, but they're there, sort of watching.
Do you think they were real or some kind of myth of Sumerian?
I believe that I'll call it the unseen world. I do believe there's an unseen world, and there are spiritual beings that inhabit the unseen world. And ancient people, and the Bible is the same way. We assign terms to them to describe what it is that we imagine they do, maybe even what they would look like if they were material. And so in one sense, yeah, I think they're real. Whether the descriptions I mean, how would we ever know, George? I mean, what really goes on in the unseen world? But if they're given descriptions and they're intelligent entities, they're real entities, they must have something to do. They must do something, and so the ancient people are just like we are. We're trying to describe what we think's going on.
Well, if I were on this planet a long time ago, and beings came down from somewhere, in my feeble little brain, I would have considered them as gods too.
I think in modern times, if we ever saw something like that happen, we would sort of think of them the same way. We might even use words like gods, because they're not. All God really is in the ancient world is somebody who's not human. It transcends humanity, that sort of thing.
Right.
My big gripe, is not, again, the idea that could there be extraterrestrials. We've had.
You believe that's very possible?
Oh yeah, I believe it's very possible. I don't have any theological problem with it. I think it would really be fascinating. It's one of those things that you kind of hope that in your lifetime, something along those lines gets settled, because it would just be so interesting.
Do you think we've been visited?
My honest answer is I don't know, because I can't claim omniscience. I would like there to be something really concrete, something that would be, really past the bar of testable science, before I would really think, this is something that has happened. I don't see anything out there like that. I see some things that are suggestive, but I don't really see anything specifically like that, either in the Bible or any of these other ancient texts. Okay. I think there are good explanations for a lot of it, and sometimes, again, it's an allegorizing of the text when the details aren't actually there. Sometimes it's a translation issue. So the concept that there could be intelligent life elsewhere, I think most people are open to that, regardless of where they're at in other things associated with
and it's growing.
Yeah, I don't think that you're going to trend away from that. I would be astonished if that ever happened. So I think most people are open to that. I'm certainly open to that, but I don't accept Sitchin's theories for some of these reasons. Again, I need to see it in the text. If you're going to say that the Sumerian or whatever text says this or has this story, I want you to show me the line in the cuneiform text. I want the chapter and the verse, so to speak.
Mike, if you were to sit down with Zecharia and have him point out these tablets, these texts, and show you where he thinks it talks about genetically alteredness coming down from space, do you think that would help?
Well, in some cases, he's not going to be able to do it because it isn't there. He's depending on a retelling of the story. So it's not that he's imagining he's seeing something that isn't there. That'd be a little goofy. But he's retelling the story sort of through, a lens. And the lens is made from an idea that he had many years ago when he began his research, began writing. And now, again, I think he's completely sincere. He's committed to it. So there'd be issues like that. I'll tell you the one question I'd really like to ask him, because it isn't clear to me where he's at on this. I would ask him how he fits this in with, the God of Israel, the God of his faith, Yahweh, the God of Israel.
Oh, explain that then.
The Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, is very clear. It's very firm that Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, is an uncreated being. It's one of those fundamental ideas.
Always was, always will.
Right.
Okay.
It's a very fundamental idea in the Jewish scriptures. And so, by definition, he really can't be an extraterrestrial, because you'd have to sort of be an inhabitant of the physical world, somewhere in the universe to do that. And so, I would want to know, does he still view Yahweh as an uncreated being?
Okay.
Or is Yahweh sort of a player in this story that he's articulating in his books? And I sense a little bit of tension in his writings on that, but I don't really see sort of a clear where he comes out on that. So that would be my one question to him.
Are you saying, one, that extraterrestrials from another planet in our solar system did not come down to this planet and genetically alter us?
Right. I don't believe that's the case.
All right. Did extraterrestrials come to this planet at all based on his interpretations?
Well, no, I don't think that he's put up any real evidence for that, and I don't think anybody else has either. Again, there are items that you look at in an ancient text, or you have some archaeological anomaly, and it's easy for us because we've been thinking, in our technological society, our scientifically oriented society. Plus, we know what space travel is now. It's easy for us to sort of assign that possibility to that artifact or to that description in a text. But the fact that we can assign that to it and we can entertain that thought doesn't make it so. And so what I want, what I need to sort of make that jump is I need the scientific community to come along and say, hey, A, there are intelligent extraterrestrials. I mean,
right.
That's the first thing you have to have. And then B, we think we have actual scientific evidence here that they have come here, regardless of what time it is. I mean, that would be nice to throw that in there too. But I mean, fundamentally, that's what I need. Philosophically, again, I'm open to there being intelligent extraterrestrials. And so if I'm open to that, then I need to be open to the other thing as well. Well, if they are out there, they could have come here. Well, sure, they could have. I would just like to. I'd like to have something, somebody in the scientific
a little more
nail that
there.
down.
All right. Did anything, in your opinion, Michael? Did anything happen?
Well, I think that again. I think there is an unseen world. I think that there are. Again, we use the word gods, and religious texts use a whole bunch of different words: gods, angels, demons, critters, Rahab, Leviathan, chaos monsters like Tiamat, and all this kind of stuff. There's a whole wide vocabulary for the beings that the ancient person believed inhabited the unseen world, and I think there's an unseen world too. So yeah, I think things happened. I think that world is active. I think it does interact with humanity. It's not extraterrestrial by definition. Now, if we find out that there are extraterrestrials, and if we found out that they had actually come here, then we would sort of have to reprocess, what some of these texts are saying, and that's really where Sitchin's at. He has made that jump, and so he's reprocessing the texts in light of that belief that he has. It's really that simple. Again, he's retelling the story based upon a different trajectory. He's looking at it from a different angle, and he's informed again by the view that he holds. So he's retelling the story that's in these texts, and since I'm not there, I'm not embracing the story, and I'm not retelling it the same way. I would just say, look, there's an unseen world. That's what these texts describe. These are entities that exist.
They might be angels. Who knows?
Yeah.
Right?
Whether the descriptions that are given really conform to real-time reality as to what they were doing is a different question. But I think that there is an unseen world that interacts with human beings and always has. So there's antiquity there too.
You agree to disagree, but you do both believe that something very unusual has been going on.
I think we would both agree with the statement that non-human intelligences have interacted with humankind. I think that would be something we would both affirm. Now, we're going to define what a non-human intelligence is in a different way. He's going to say extraterrestrial. I'm going to say it's not from another planet. I'm sort of like the Jacques Vallée person here,
mm-hmm.
that they're from here.
Yeah.
Wherever here is. And again, we have to use...
And whatever here is.
Yeah, we have to use these geographical terms because we're creatures of time and we're creatures of a terrestrial existence. And so we have to use words like directions, north, south, east, west. We have to, use words like this side and that side of reality, this universe and that. what else are we going to do? I mean, we can't invent vocabulary that has no correspondence to our own reality. So we use these terms to do the best job we can.
Because we're talking about the Bible, you've looked at this. The first chapter of Ezekiel, I got to tell you, to me, sounds like a spaceship.
Well, it would, again, because that's the way we're parsing. I actually, personally, I think this is one of the easier passages to explain because we get lucky in this one. We actually know what Ezekiel saw. And the reason we know is because Ezekiel's in Babylon. If you read the first chapter of Ezekiel, he's sitting there in Babylon, and he has this vision. And all the elements of his vision, when he's seeing, and he calls it a throne. There's a throne on a platform, and on the throne there's one, a human-looking being. From the waist up, of course, it's just luminous light and all this kind of stuff. And there are cherubim underneath the throne with their wings touching. All this whole stock description, every part of it conforms to Babylonian sculpture and iconography for divine thrones. And there are dozens of examples of divine thrones from that period, from that place, that we can look at and see, well, that's exactly what Ezekiel's describing. So in that case, we get lucky. What he's describing is not a flying craft like we would think of in terms of a UFO or something like that. It is a throne, and back then thrones did have wheels. They did have cherubim that were sculpted below the base. A cherubim, a karuv in Akkadian, is just a guardian, a throne guardian. And in the Mesopotamian world, they were usually depicted as sort of lion-like. They could have four faces. I have some pictures of those, too. What's really interesting to me about the Ezekiel reference is the four faces of the cherubim described in Ezekiel in chapter 1 and in chapter 10 are the four cardinal points of the Babylonian zodiac. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's right. something going on there. I think, to me, the point of Ezekiel's vision is, look, he's Jewish. We're sitting here in Babylon. We've been taken into exile. And it looks like Marduk, who is the god of Babylon, has defeated our God, Yahweh, because why else would we be here? And Ezekiel's saying, no, that isn't the case. We're not parsing it correctly. We're here because of our own failures. And I see the Lord on this throne, and the throne extends the four corners of the earth, not only the earth, but the four corners of the cosmos. It's the four cardinal points of the zodiac. And at the center of all this is Yahweh, the God of Israel. I think the message is that even though we're here in Babylon, our God is still in control. And I'm telling you, we're going to be out of here in 70 years. It's not going to be forever. God is still in control, that kind of thing. And, of course, historically, that's the way it played out. They were gone in 70 years under the Persians. So I think that the whole point was a statement of sovereignty. Marduk is not the one in control here. It's, the God of Israel. And he puts the God of Israel on a Babylonian throne with Babylonian zodiac imagery. He inserts the God of Israel right there at the heart of the matter. And like I said, we get lucky on this one because we have the sculpture. There are a lot of things we don't have visuals for, and you just have to wonder, well, what does he mean, or what is that, supposed to be saying? But in this case, I think we get a little lucky.
Many of the things we've talked about close to your novel, The Facade, let's touch on that for just a second, Michael. What was your message in The Facade?
I spent 10 years total in graduate school listening to talk radio, and probably 7 or 8 of those, the last 7 or 8, were coast to coast. And it just drew me into so many subjects. And I had a lifelong interest in a number of these things. And I thought, my field is ancient text and ancient languages and biblical theology, and there are so many connection points here, and all these subjects really are asking big picture questions. Why are we here? Who are we? All this sort of stuff. I thought I could really come up with a good story, and wouldn't it be fun to weave all this stuff together and write a novel? And I started that, but to be honest with you, it started to become more meaningful to me. It started to be a vehicle for how I could articulate kind of what I what I think the intersection points really are. And I just got drawn into it. And so I wanted to say that, hey, if there's a message in the facade, it's that, look, these subjects are really important because they intersect with some of the fundamental questions about human existence and what goes on Earth and what goes on in the unseen world. And I wanted to tie those things together.
Zecharia, his latest work has to do with the Sumerian queen, Puabi. And he is calling for the remains of this queen to be genetically tested, which he claims then will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that we have extraterrestrial genetics. Your thoughts?
Well, in light of the recent DNA testing, with King Tut and his family, his lineage, and even the Neanderthal genome issue, I understand it. But the problem with it is to know that you have extraterrestrial DNA, you have to first know what that looks like. Otherwise, you're telling the geneticist, hey, I want you to go looking for this thing that you've never seen. We don't have a sample of it. We don't even in fact know it exists. So when you spot it, let me know.
Well, can you find something, though, that is not of this earth? You
can find something that you don't know why it's there. Let's take junk DNA, for example.
Okay.
There's been a lot of talk about junk DNA. Well, it's part of the human genome, but it's referred to as junk DNA because its purpose can't be discerned. So you could find stuff like that in a sample, and you'd go, well, it's here, and we have no reason because we don't have an actual intelligent or an actual we don't have biological remains of a true intelligent extraterrestrial. So there's no way we can conclude that this is alien because we don't have sort of the control, part of the experiment. We don't have that at all. But we see something here that's in the genome, and we don't really know what it does. But see, that's a different question. What it does and is it non-human are two different questions. Now, we could detect if it's non-human, if we, how would we do that? Well, we would run it against every other known carbon-based life form that isn't human, and if there was no match there, then that might raise the question, okay, it doesn't really conform to the junk DNA that we know is in the human genome, and there's nothing else on the planet that has the same signaturing, so we can't pin it somewhere else. And frankly, we couldn't because animals and humans can't interbreed. So you run up against all these scientific and biological roadblocks to it being a meaningful thing to do. But I understand it entirely because of the work that's being done in these other areas. But it's really looking for something that you don't know what it looks like and eliminating it from things that can't be there anyway. And so you really have sort of a conundrum when it comes to what Zechariah Sitchin's urge is, what's really compelling him to have it done. I don't know how would it ever be any result that would be meaningful one direction or the other. But I understand the question.
Would you, though, if you had the ability to give approval and he came to you and said, we want to exhume the remains and do a test here, would you let him?
Oh, yeah. I don't think there's any reason not to do it. I, of course, do not have that authority. But, yeah, I can't think of any reason not to.
You're not Michael Shermer. You're not like a skeptic, are you?
No. He and I would not get along terribly well. I mean, he seems like a nice enough guy, but skeptics like Michael Shermer, I hate to use this analogy, but I guess I'll use it. They're sort of like fundamentalists on the opposite side, that they can only see things in black and white.
Michael, over the ages, what do you think people have been seeing? What are they witnessing?
Well, I would say in antiquity, there are actually some really good scholarly articles on phenomenon that get reported in the sky, like in Greco-Roman literature and that sort of thing.
Ancient stuff.
Yeah, ancient stuff. A lot of it, the vocabulary that's used is the vocabulary for like weather or meteorological phenomena and that sort of thing. But there are some things that really defy that sort of simple explanation. So just as today, I think we see some really, really rare things like these corkscrews in the sky recently and that sort of thing, and we have to scientists really have to noodle, what could that be? And they come up with explanations. I think some of it could be that. And I'm willing to let the anomalous be a category here. So I think in the ancient world, it's kind of like today. You could probably put things that are seen into 4, 5, 6 different categories. And one of those, to me, again, this is what would separate me from somebody like, Philip Klaus or Shermer that just, never wanted to believe anything, is that the anomalous is a definite category, and a spiritual explanation is a definite category. They don't have any room for either of those.